Добар ден на сите. Од името на Институтот за европска политика сакам да ви посакам добри дојде на овој топол ден во месец јуни. Би најпрвен околу, за да можете да го преживеете, позади имаме вода, ако некој сакате од колегите да помогне со водата, може слободно да си земете претходно, бидејќи јасно ни е дека не е многу, денов не е оптимален за вакви собири, меѓутоа како што го кажав тоа, да ви се заблагодарам затоа што сте со нас на денешниот ден, на денешниот настан кој што ни е посветен на 20 годишнината од Солунската агенда. Солун прослави 20 години вчера, на 21 јуни, а воедно во овие 2-3 дена е исто така 30 годишнината на копенхагенските критериуми. Односно самите од Копенхаген беше пред точно 30 на години. И за нас како Институт за европска политика ова беше веројатно еден клучен повод да ја собереме оваа група која што е дел од заинтересираната јавност во Република Северна Македонија, да продискутираме каде сме, меѓутоа и да рефлектираме на тоа каде ќе одиме во наредните веројатно 20 или пак 30 години. Поради тоа, клучната цел на денешната дискусија ни беше да видиме наназад, меѓутоа исто така да ја отвориме и да ја поврземе нашата приказна на европската интеграција, односно заедно која што ја делиме заедно со сите овие луѓе во собата, со приказната на земјите кои што станаа кандидати минатиот јуни, и да видиме како би можеле овие две приказни подобро да се поврзат и попродуктивно да работиме сите заедно. Денеска сме тука некаде до 5:30 часот. Ќе имаме еден краток воведен панел на кој што со нас исклучително ми е драго бидејќи успеавме да ги имаме веројатно двете најважни лица на европската интеграција во нашата земја, односно амбасадорот Дейвид Гир, кој што е еден поддржувач на европската агенда и кој што бил со нас како организација доста долг период и кој што не познава. Воедно би сакала да споменам дека оваа активност е дел од оперативната поддршка која што има Институтот за европска политика од делегацијата на Европската унија во насока на тоа да ги поврземе дискусиите кај нас со дискусиите во Европската унија за проширувањето, за владењето на правото, за да можеме да ги изградиме овие мостови. Драго ни е бидејќи ние во изминатата декада работиме макотрпно на овие прашања, некогаш поуспешно, некогаш помалку успешно, некогаш со поголем ефект, меѓутоа драго ни е што оваа работа беше препознаена како дел од оперативната поддршка од делегацијата. Дополнително со нас е вице-премиерот Бојан Маричик, кој што имал неколку капи во минатото, веројатно и најпознати од претходниот граѓанското општество, поради што и очекуваме од него да чуеме со сите тие капи каде одиме и каде се движиме нанапред. Најпрвен би се сакала пред да заминете да се заблагодарам на колегите од Институтот за европска политика, доколку оние кои што ќе не напуштат пред крај, да знаете дека им благодарам за поддршката во организацијата на овој настан, да се заблагодарам на сите колеги кои што ќе ни бидат на двата панели, кои што допатуваа од далеку, поминаа веројатно долг ден вчера за да може да стигнат, вклучително со авионот од Виена кој што задоцни дел од нив беа мора да си легнаа во 3 сат наутро. Меѓутоа добро е што го направивме овој настан попладне. Агендата ја видовте на првиот панел, само уште би сакала да им се заблагодарам лично на панелистите. На првиот панел ќе ни се обрати поранешната вице-премиерка и министерка за одбрана Радмила Шекеринска, заедно со Срđan Мајсторовиќ од Србија и професорката Милица Увалич од Универзитетот во Перуџа. Благодарам од моје име што сте со нас. Со нив ќе рефлектираме на тоа што каде сме денеска после 20 години од Солун, а во вториот дел после некаде 3:30 часот ќе се осврнеме на новите дискусии за моделите за промена на проширувањето, при што со нас тука е професорката Елена Джанкич од Европскиот институт во Фиренца, Денис Ченуша од Молдова, кој што воедно работи и во Литванија и во голем дел од земјите од источното партнерство, од она што го знаевме како источно партнерство барем, и Јана Јузова од Институтот Европеум од Чешка. На дел од вас кои што беа на минатата година на нашата конференција имаме исти лица, имаме нови лица, меѓутоа и вие сте со нас повторно, што значи дека веројатно би требали и вам да ви се заблагодариме што сте со нас редовно како институт. Сега би му дал воведен збор на амбасадорот Дейвид Гир. Повелете, амбасадоре.
Благодарам. Почитувана госпожа Кацарска, почитуван вице-премиер Маричич, почитувани паналисти, почитувани гости, дами и господа. Ви благодарам за поканата. On the 21st of June, as you know, 2003, the European Union took the historic step of offering the countries of the Western Balkans a European perspective. As you will remember, back then, the European Union had 15 member states. The Thessaloniki Summit, during which the offer was made, took place 1 year before the big enlargement with 10 new countries, 4 years before the accession of Bulgaria and Romania, and a decade before that of Croatia. The Thessaloniki agenda not only confirmed the EU perspective of the region, it also underlined the transformative power of the EU enlargement process itself. Now, while there has been important areas of progress since Thessaloniki, and I've mentioned some, we all have to recognize that it has been less than hoped at the time. We have to approach this issue with a certain humility. We in the European Union, but also partners in the region. For the EU, the case of North Macedonia has been the most telling. The country's path has been blocked during these past 20 years as a result of 3 vetoes. As a result, the EU's credibility has been seriously damaged, and people are understandably frustrated. But there are also responsibilities on the part of partners in the region. The EU does not bear primary responsibility for the failures of successive governments in the region to enact reforms, to overcome political polarization, and to act decisively on issues such as the fight against corruption and the strengthening of the rule of law. This is not to ignore the advances that have been made, but also to talk about responsibilities. Too often, politicians and commentators look to the European Union and other international partners to resolve issues which can only be tackled by leadership at home. Now, this is important today because I believe that we are once more living through a period of dramatic change and opportunity. Geostrategic developments linked to Russia's war on Ukraine have put the issue of EU integration high on the EU agenda once more. There is a new intensity and seriousness on the part of EU leaders, an understanding that the enlargement of the European Union is a matter of European interest, defined in terms of security, stability, prosperity, and our democratic development. Some people argue that the EU's interest in enlargement today is a temporary mood change. Personally, I doubt this very much, given the very profound changes in thinking on the future of Europe and global security which are taking place in capitals across the European Union and beyond. And I invite you to read Emmanuel Macron's speech at the GlobeSec a few weeks ago, in which he expressed strong commitment to enlargement as well as EU internal reform as a matter of national and European interest. But whatever your reading of the current situation may be, it is clear that today there is renewed momentum, and momentum in politics and in international affairs is a rare commodity, gold dust to advocates of change, something which should not be squandered. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this momentum translated last year, as you remember, into offers of a European perspective to Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia with certain conditions, included the opening of accession negotiations with Albania and with North Macedonia, candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and progress on visa liberalization with Kosovo. Recently, the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, went a step further. She said, it's not enough to just wait for our friends outside the Union to move closer to us or to say that the door is open. We must also take responsibility to bring the aspiring members of our Union much closer to us. And with these remarks, she recalled first the solidarity measures that the EU extended to the Western Balkan countries, as it did towards member states, to support vulnerable households against high energy costs, to build new infrastructure to reduce the Western Balkans' dependency on Russian fossil fuels, and yes, in the context of COVID too. But she also set out a new growth plan for the Western Balkans consisting of a number of elements. First, to bring the Western Balkans closer to the EU single market prior to enlargement itself. Second, to deepen economic integration. Third, to accelerate fundamental reforms. And fourth, to increase pre-accession funds. And these ideas will be developed further in the coming months, so watch this space. I would make a few comments here. Firstly, these plans seek to respond to requests from the region that highlight the need for the benefits of enlargement to be felt during the accession process itself and not at the end. Secondly, the offer of closer integration with parts of the single market prior to accession itself is potentially transformatory. The single market, the world's most successful single market of some 450 million people, 23 million companies, 56 million jobs, has been one of the main drivers of growth in the European Union. Indeed, it's calculated that every citizen in the European Union gains more than 840 euros per year thanks to the existence of the single market. Now, given that all of the countries of the Western Balkans are struggling to promote economic convergence with the EU, and if we take North Macedonia, the convergence of income with EU 27 average is still only at 41.5%. This offer is fundamental. Thirdly, there is an emphasis on reforms because change cannot happen without reform. And lastly, additional funds are linked to the achievement of reforms. Finally, I'd like to say a word on the way ahead for North Macedonia. I believe there is a real danger today that the country is driven by the understandable frustrations and disappointments of the recent past, that it becomes captured by these experiences, turning in on itself, lacking the confidence to take the steps which I believe would lead to renewal and the emergence of a stronger, more self-assured and prosperous country with a better future, one which offers the prospect of reversing over time the hemorrhaging of young people abroad. And this means a number of things. First, putting aside party political considerations and putting the national interest first. In this regard, the issue of the constitutional amendments, a sovereign decision for this country to take, is an important step, which if taken would lead automatically and without any further decision or veto to the holding of a second intergovernmental conference, a decisive moment in this country's path to the EU's membership. It's important to have an open debate on this issue focused on what really is at stake and where the country's interest lies, not one based on fears from the past or anxiety about the future. Of course, it will be for the political parties and for the individual members of parliament to take political responsibility for the decisions they take, assessing the opportunities at hand and risks of delay. Secondly, reforms. The pace of reforms has slowed significantly, and there are developments in recent months in the areas of the rule of law and the fight against corruption, which are not what we would expect of a country that is now negotiating membership, whose main focus should be on moving forward through reforms towards membership of the EU, across government, across all institutions, reforms which ultimately ordinary citizens are calling for. Thirdly, political polarization. We have witnessed time and again in countries that have successfully completed accession negotiations that the only way forward is for political parties from across the political divide to come together and make enlargement-related reforms a national project, the top priority. I don't mean by this that it's necessary to create some kind of grand coalition. That is a matter entirely for the parties. But there does need to be a common agreement to put enlargement first, and so that the country progressively meets the practical benchmarks and reform criteria set down by the European Union. These are essential to building resilience and capacity in the country so that, as a member of the European Union, it can compete effectively in a very competitive and innovative environment, be a force for stability and prosperity, promoting democratic values, and thereby reaping the practical benefits of EU membership. Don't let the failings of the past 20 years, for which we all have responsibilities, lead to a lost decade for this country. The road to the European Union is clear, practical, and realistic. 2030 is achievable if there is political determination matched by decisive action and underpinned by unity of purpose across the political divide. We will be there to accompany you. We want North Macedonia in the European Union. Thank you. Ви благодарам. Фалам интерес.
Благодарам, амбасадор Гир. Сега би му дала збор на вице-премиерот Бојан Марички. Повелувам.
Благодарам, почитувана Симонида, директорке, благодарам амбасадоре. Би сакал пред да кажам било што да ги поздравам, прво да го поздравам и овој панел и идејата за организација на ваков настан на кој што ќе се дискутира за резимето на овие 20 години од Солунското ветување, затоа што во дневните дискусии, во наметнување на некои дневни теми, често и забораваме да направиме една ретроспектива, што е многу важна и за евалуација на изминатиот период, но уште поважна е за она што следува. Така што и за да не испадне дека само одаваме нели некаков јубилеј, некаков тажен јубилеј 20 години од Солунскиот самит, мислам дека и по-оптимистично треба да ги гледаме овие настани, затоа им честитам, им се заблагодарувам и на панелистите и сакам посебно да ги поздравам и господјата Шекеринска, која што во тоа време, во 2003 година, беше на позицијата вице-премиер за европски прашања и за нас еве од граѓанскиот сектор во тоа време беше инспирација за ангажман во оваа насока, но и на професорката Увалич и на Срđan Мајсторовиќ, кои што се навистина посветени во следењето на европските интеграции на целиот регион и директната помош со вклученост и со работа во многу формати регионално, секако и за гостите од Прага и од Молдова и за професорката од Фиренца. Мислам дека е важно да даваме и меѓународен контекст на се тоа што го дискутираме со повеќе погледи и повеќе шанси. Многу работи што беа важни ги кажа амбасадорот Гир, јас ќе се обидам да кажам неколку оценки, но исто така и неколку коментари околу тоа што сме постигнале до сега во овие 20 години, што не сме успеале да постигнеме и што следува понатаму во наредните 10 или 20. Клучната порака што мислам дека тогаш 15 лидери на Унијата на самитот во Солун е дека Западен Балкан може да стане дел од Европската Унија, но само доколку бидат вложени големи напори за постигнување на европските стандарди, демократијата и човековите права. Секако уште тука посебен акцент се става на регионалната соработка и обезбедување на надворешен мир и преговори меѓу државите во регионот, што е предизвик до ден денес. Значи, треба да бидеме тука доволно искрени и самокритични да кажеме дека темата регионална соработка и билатерални прашања меѓу државите кои што се на Западен Балкан, но и меѓу државите од Западен Балкан со државите членки на ЕУ се предизвик 20 години до ден денес. Така што мислам дека проблемот е што веројатно не доволно сериозно и искрено тогаш пред 20 години сме пристапиле кон овие или недоволно свесни за потенцијалот на овие предизвици низ годините, или пак како што можеби и денес или пред неколку години не сме ги земале доволно свесни предизвиците од некои спорови или од некои прашања, се додека не нараснале до мерка на блокада или до мерка до ниво на вето. Но исто така е важно дека самитот во Солун потврди дека Европската унија има перцепција кон нашиот регион како целина, како регата или како регион, но во исто време дава шанса сепак секоја држава да биде индивидуално наградена за напредокот. Во овој случај, мислам дека само Хрватска успеа да отплави од групата на Западен Балкан, а во меѓувреме придојдоа Црна Гора и Косово, кои што во моментот во 2003 година не екзистираа на таков начин како посебни субјекти, како што екзистираат денес. 20 години по Солунскиот самит, земјите од регионот се движат со различни брзини и тоа можеше веројатно се предвиди уште тогаш. Хрватска е членка веќе 10 години, Црна Гора и Србија се во преговори за членство од 2012, односно 2014 година поинтензивно за Србија. Босна и Херцеговина доби кандидатски статус минатата година. Косово се уште е потенцијален кандидат за членство и дури минатата година доби, односно оваа година се стекна со можноста за визна либерализација, а Северна Македонија и Албанија ги започнаа формално преговорите на 19 јули минатата година и се сега веќе во фаза на скрининг, а се очекува по завршувањето на врските од скринингот и уставните амандмани за нас да влеземе во наредната фаза на отварање на кластерот 1. Во меѓувреме имавме повеќе обиди да се заживее политиката на проширување. И тоа исто така треба да го уважиме и признаеме. Прашање е колку тие биле успешни. За нас конкретно имавме обиди за пристапен диалог на високо ниво, во моментите кога Србија и Црна Гора започнаа преговори. Потоа имавме нов пристап, кој што го донесе комисијата на Јункер, која даде за жал направи нов пристап, но даде една лоша политичка оценка дека во мандатот на таа комисија нема да има ново проширување, и мислам дека тие зборови одекнуваат до ден денес во политичките кругови во Брисел, и се обидуваме тоа ехо од тој став на комисијата на председателот Јункер да го промениме со сите последователни наративи и со се што направи последователно Европската унија од тогаш наваму. Тој нов пристап беше преточен во нова методологија во за нас, за жал, најлошиот можен момент. Во моментот кога очекувавме по усвојување на Преспанскиот договор и негова имплементација и членството во НАТО, кое што веќе беше готова работа на крајот на 2019 година, и кога очекувавме вториот столб на придобивките од Преспанскиот договор да го верификуваме или да го искористиме, така да кажам подобро, тогаш се случи одлуката да се развива нова методологија. И мислам дека тоа беше една силна погрешна проценка на Европската унија, која што направи два нуспродукти од кои што и денес не можеме целосно да се ослободиме или да ги надминеме. Првиот е разочарување кај голем дел на проевропски ориентираните граѓани, дека навистина и покрај тоа што направивме се и реформското портфолио беше одлично токму во таа година, и во тие неколку години, 2 години меѓу 17 и 19, сепак не и го решивме спорот со Грција, не успеавме да ги почнеме преговорите. Разочарувањето беше огромно и тоа не треба да се потценува ниту премолчува. Треба да се искористи како лекција и како влог за натамошните чекори. И вториот нуспроизвод на таа ситуација беше дека се отвори портата за нови блокади. Односно, поточно, се отвори портата за прашањата кои Бугарија и онака ги имаше, и сигурни сме дека во текот на разговорите ќе се најдеа на еден или друг начин на преговарачката маса, завземаа позиција, односно го сватија како порака дека има се уште време, дека не е моментумот за почеток на преговорите сега и дека се уште има време за поставување на нови услови и на нови можности за блокада. И тоа мислам дека е стратешки пропуст, кој што за среќа се од страна на Европската унија се надмина бргу, бидејќи во март 20 година беше донесена одлуката за почеток на преговорите со нас и со Албанија, меѓутоа моментумот веќе не беше ист, започна ковид кризата, приоритетите се промени и натаму сето знаеме како изгледаше. Таа нова методологија ни дава шанса да го разговараме она што е пак позитивната страна од тоа што се случи со новата методологија, тоа што го зборуваше амбасадорот Гир. Таа нова методологија ни дава шанса да ги динамизираме преговорите, тие да бидат посуштински и подинамични. Оние кандидати што се поподготвени со политичка волја и со институционална подготвеност да се движат побрзо, да има можност да се евалуира постојано напредокот во некои области, тоест доколку тој не постои или има назадување да можат да се вратат и преговорите, секако и динамиката на преговорите назад, под одредени услови и со пододредени процедури. И токму заради овој нов пристап имаме денес шанса да разговараме за забрзано или фазно пристапување или како тоа би се вклопило во оваа нова методологија, за овие постулати за кои што зборуваше и амбасадорот, но мислам дека сепак забрзаното или фазното пристапување е комплексен механизам и целиот преговарачки процес во кој што е битно да цело време да држите јасна визија кои се приоритетните области каде што сакате и можете брзо да напредувате и кои се областите каде што ви треба повеќе време и стратешки ќе одлучите дека нема да бидат веднаш целосно усогласени или дури за некои од нив веќе уште сега може да предвидиме дека целосно може да бидат усогласени дури во транзицијски период по членство. Тука мислам дека само треба да сме на чисто кога говориме за овие фазно пристапување или за повеќе нивоа на интеграција кои што не подразбираат веднаш членство, дека треба никогаш да не го изгубиме од фокусот и ниту еден од овие процеси да не ги прифатиме како алтернатива за полноправно членство. Туку само како фаза која што треба да не доближи до Европската унија побргу, но никако не смееме помалку да инсистираме на временски план за пристапување кон Европската унија. Ние немаме уште 20 години за да изгубиме. Немаме уште да направиме ваква конференција по 20 години и да седнеме истите тука и да речеме, па добро, еве, не е така лошо, сите помрднаа помалку. Не, ние за 20 години од сега треба овој регион да го гледаме како заокружена целина во рамките на Европската унија и тоа е доволна рамка дури и за оние држави кои што денес се можеби во една ситуација кај што се многу далеко од членство. А за државите кои што се поблиску до членство или кои што веќе преговараат, за нив треба да се направи рамка што трае помалку од една декада. Ако сакаме кредибилен пристап. Контекстот на 2003 година и Солунскиот самит тогаш, за жал не може да го предвиди она што следува после тоа. Последиците и ефектите од големото проширување со нови 10 држави членки, практично се тоа нови 12 држави членки, кои што во рок од 3 години пристапуваат кон ЕУ, и не може да ги предвиди ефектите на политичкиот дисбаланс што ќе го предизвикаат, а исто така не може да предвиди во каков развој ќе се каков развој ќе има односите меѓу ЕУ и Велика Британија, Брекзитот, ниту пак како нус производ на тоа проширување, кој што е директен производ на Брекзитот, е директен нус производ на тоа проширување и сите кризи институционални кои што беа во меѓувреме случајни. Исто така и развојот на настаните на Западен Балкан. Затоа мислам дека е важно стратешки кога размислуваме и кога подвлекуваме, правиме анализа, да можеме да предвидиме што може да предизвика наредното проширување и како да го изведеме за да донесе на тамошна стабилизација и развој, а што помалку политички потреси. И тука има неколку работи што ќе ги ќе ги искоментирам. Но во никој случај не смееме да прифатиме каква било замена за полноправното членство, а сите идеи за приближување пред членството треба да ни бидат атрактивни. Според мене не треба да бегаме од нив и да ги гледаме како страшило, туку да ги зграбиме и да ги искористиме и да покажеме дека сме ние подготвени за повеќе да бидеме во Европската унија денес. Затоа јас ги поздравувам сите тие предлози и предлозите што ги спомна господин амбасадор околу можностите што ги кажа претседателката на Европската комисија, и мислам дека треба заедно уште летово да ги дефинираме јасно областите каде што е реално да се забрза пристапувањето или да имаме некои формати и можности отворени пред членство. Ние веќе ги имаме податоците од скринингот за првите 3 кластери и можеме да ја направиме таа анализа не за краток период, за да имаме една јасна слика каде можеме веднаш да испорачаме во оваа смисла во која што каже амбасадорот. И затоа мислам дека не смеме да дозволиме ниту говорот на претседателот Макрон, ниту говорот на претседателката фон дер Лајен да останат само убави идеи и убави говори, туку треба заеднички од двете страни уште ова лето да направиме акцијски план или план, како сакате наречете го, идеја како ќе го спроведеме сето тоа што беше кажано на дело, затоа што одговара на тоа што ние го сакаме. Исто така би ги поддржал и политичката поддршка што добивме од Бундестагот и што има најава дека може да дојде од други држави членки, затоа што сметам дека тоа ќе ја релаксира атмосферата кај нас и ќе ја намали фрустрацијата за која што говори амбасадорот, што мислам дека е реална и дека треба на неја да работиме, за да ја надминеме, а не за да ја зацементираме како наша позиција кон Европската унија. Сите ние ја доживеавме истата фрустрација во 2008 година, кога се соочивме со ветото на Грција за членство во НАТО. Таа фрустрација ја забетониравме како наша долгорочна политика и 10 години подоцна, по многу полоши услови, се договоривме за да ги оствариме нашите стратешки цели. Ние сето ова го правиме за да ги оствариме нашите стратешки цели, а не за да останат само убави желби на хартија и неостварени со ништо. На крајот само сакам да кажам дека ако сакаме да од Солун наваму, од Солунскиот самит наваму, чекалната за ЕУ само се полни, а малку се празни. Значи само една држава излегла од чекалната, а зборувам од регионот Западен Балкан, а чекалната е наполнета дополнително со држави кои што до вчера припаѓале на источното партнерство и немале европска перспектива во смисла на членство. А сега е геостратешкиот момент на промена во перспективата е токму тоа. Што овие држави кои што до вчера беа нарекувани источно партнерство и немаа европска перспектива во смисла на членство, денес е тоа веќе поинаку поставено. И тоа треба исто така да го искористиме. Потребно е работа од двете страни. Ова е двонасочна улица. Немојте да мислите дека може само со домашни реформи и со носење на тешки одлуки, ниту дека може само со стратешки одлуки и датуми, индикативни датуми од Европската унија. Тоа е еден цел пакет. Ние мора да имаме временски план од страна на Европската унија, а мора да испорачаме реформи кои што ги спомна амбасадорот и да испорачаме тешки одлуки врзани со билатерални прашања. Но сакам да направам една поента во врска со реформите и тука ќе завршам. Треба да сме, ако одиме подлабоко во анализата, а јас веќе имам доволно искуство и во владата, и во работа во владата во последниве 6 години, за да можам да дадам оценка од овој тип. Мислам дека што повеќе процесот на европски интеграции е оптоварен со прашања кои што се нетипични за процесот, како што се билатералните прашања или историската комисија, или, не знам, уставните измени, дури да ги кажеме, и да не редиме, други, доволно са вие. Што повеќе се оптеретува тој процес, толку помалку ќе има ентузијазам за реформи, бидејќи институциите, политичарите и граѓаните ќе мислат дека суштината на тој процес не се реформите, туку се овие други прашања. Јас знам дека тоа звучи како изговор, меѓутоа веруете, многу е тешко да наметнете реформска тема врзана со правосудство, ако морате во многу краток рок во наредниот период да соберете 80 претеници за уставни амандмани. Многу е тешко. Не велам дека е невозможно. И затоа мислам дека треба по завршувањето на овие уставни измени на вистина да ги тргнеме од маса, барем да ги нормализираме во еден процес на разговори со Бугарија и со другите држави членки, да ги нормализираме во еден тек на разговори кои што нема вака да влијаат и да прават ваков потрес на процесот на европска интеграција, на било која држава, во нашиот случај на Северна Македонија. Ако тоа се случи, верувајте дека секоја влада и доколку го постигнеме тој национален консензус за кој што зборувате, дека на вистина никој не калкулира партиско-политички со процесот на евроинтеграција, тоа што сме го имали во Хрватска и во некои други држави, доколку тоа се случи, ние ќе имаме сила да совладаме која било пречка. Дали се работи за решавање на корупцијата, дали се работи за носење на тешки одлуки и закони, дали се работи за кршење на некои општествени и пазарни монополи, што ќе видите во пракса дека ќе биде многу поголем проблем од тоа што денес не се чинат некои законски промени или уставни промени, и дали сме способни и да дадеме соодветен поттик на институциите да ги имплементираат европските закони во пракса. Јас мислам дека сето тоа е возможно, но дека е потребно искрено да разговараме кои политички субјекти, кои политички структури се за членство во Европската Унија, со сите последици врзани со членството, а кои глумат дека се за или само кажуваат дека се за, без да се бидат подготвени да направат чекори и да донесат одлуки за членство. Бидејќи нашата низа на одлуки, поврзани со тешки прашања за членство во Европската Унија, не врзани за Бугарија, туку врзани за задачите кои произлегуваат од скринингот, не завршуваат со дента на уставните измени, туку тогаш започнуваат. Тогаш ќе ни дојдат на маса сите оние теми кои што во меѓувреме заради висока политика сме морале и сме требале да ги ставиме во втор план, тогаш нема да имаме можност и добро е што нема да имаме можност да ги ставиме во втор план. Затоа мислам дека е битно општествениот консензус да се изгради што побрзо и политичкиот консензус што побрзо, за да имаме целосна сила за да ги завршиме сите овие обврски, кои што треба да ги ограничиме временски во наредните 4 до 5 години, да го затвориме процесот, за да можеме да се надеваме до 2030 дека ќе станеме членки, а верувам дека тоа е стварливо, само ако работиме на тоа искрено и посветено. Ви благодарам.
Благодарам, Бојан, благодарам, амбасадоре, за воведот. Јас, кога почнавме, ќе споменав колку на време почнуваме и како секој оди на време, меѓутоа ние веќе досниме 20 минути, така да нема повеќе да го злоупотребувам своето улога на модератор, ќе имам свое време во вториот панел. Само би се заблагодарила за тоа што мислам дека ни дадовте доста за размислување во контекст на она што ќе го говориме на наредните два панели. Бас би ве замолила да, само дека ќе имаме 2 минути промена на сцената, би ги поканила колегите од вториот панел. Амбасадорот ми најави дека ќе биде со нас за време на првиот панел. За Бојан немам најава, меѓутоа би се заблагодарила секако на двајцата. Повелете Ардита, Милица, Радмила, Срđan.
Dear Ambassador, dear guests, dear friends, colleagues, Welcome to today's conference, Forum Europeum, 20 years after Thessaloniki. I'm glad to moderate today's panel on this special occasion. 20 years ago, we had some of the speakers engaged in the process, so I'm very excited to hear from them. So today with us, Simonida already announced the panel, but today with us are Ms. Radmila Shekerinska. She is the Vice President of PES, former official, dear friend of EPI. We have Professor Milica Uvalic from University of Perugia in Italy, and we have Srđan Majstorović, President of the European Policy Center, President of the Board of the European Policy Center in Belgrade. Because we are late with time, I don't want to take up more with my introductory remarks. I will start with the first question to Ms. Shekerinska. What are the key successes in these 20 years?
Добар ден на сите, благодарам на поканата. Организаторите беа прилично фини со нас, ни кажаа што очекуваат да зборуваме, ама ја ги слушав првите два говори и малку ќе го сменам пристапот, затоа што ќе ги кажувам по мене лекциите во изминативе 20 години, меѓутоа пред се фокусира на каде сме денес и каде сакаме да бидеме во следните 20 години. И по мене се кристализираат две прашања кои што колку и да различно ги формулираме прашањата, тие ни доминираат. Првото прашање е дали реално постои нов момент. Значи, дали има вистински геополитички контекст кој што ги смени состојбите и колку тој ќе трае. Еве, можеби тоа второто е по-интересно. И второто прашање како да си помогнеме со реформите. И ако се вратам назад 20 години, ќе кажам дека слични беа дилемите и тогаш. Други беа реформите, друга беше геополитичката реалност. Меѓутоа, во суштина, цело време мораме постојано да го следиме каде е светот, односно каде е Европа, визави Балканот, и од друга страна да се свртиме кон огледалото и да кажеме дали правиме доволно. И сега, околу моментумот, мислам дека не треба да има дилема. Дека зборуваме за променет свет, променити геополитички состојби, меѓутоа и променета Европска Унија. И по мене и по прашањето на проширување, тоа се гледа. При тоа, знаете како некој кој што во 90-тите години се мачел со војни во регионот, за нас проширувањето на Европската Унија со Полска и со Чешка изгледа или изгледаше smooth ride. Од 90-ти години одма им ги отвориле вратите, влегле, се било направено за да успее процесот. Сега предноста која после 20 години правите ретроспектива и кога ќе се вратите назад да ги прочитате текстовите, овде има поголеми експерти од мене, ќе видите дека тоа не е баш така. И дека проширувањето, како и Европската Унија, се раѓа и се бутка заради војни конфликти. Нема да кажам ништо ново, Европска Унија е проект изграден за време на војна, не после војна, за време на војна. Меѓутоа, и големото проширување е резултат на страф од војна. И вие ако погледнете 93-та година, понудата која што ја добиваат Полска, Чешка, Унгарија, е понуда trade aid, трговија и помош. Без многу комитмент и ветувања за членство. Дури 98 година, како резултат на југословенските војни, се отвара можноста, ајде да зборуваме за првите 5 членки да почнат преговори. 5 други не се квалификувани. Како резултат на војната во Косово, која што е еден фундаментален EU документ, Composite Paper, мислам дека се викаше, ја дефинираше како екзистенцијална закана по Европската Унија, земјите членки велат, ајде да почнеме преговори со другите 5, што де факто значеше нови 10 членки после неколку години. Значи, стравот од војна е тој кој што го избутка и источното проширување. И мислам дека страв од една многу поголема војна со држава со нуклеарни капацитети, дефинитивно го предизвикува истиот потрес и истите политички поместувања. Меѓутоа, како држава, треба да си го поставиме прашањето на крајот од 2023 година. Украина по се изгледа ќе ги започне преговорите за членство со Европската унија. Украина. Сакаме да бидеме во пакетот или можда да чекаме некои други изненадувања. И јас би била многу предпазлива, земајќи предвид колку сме мали, колку дури кога правиме проблем, не правиме голем проблем, мислам дека треба да ја калкулираме можноста да бидеме така, благо, без многу зборови, ама тргнати на страна. Јас, големата мана во сите овие размислувања е што малку повеќе од што треба изгледа се сеќавам. И се сеќавам на едни дебати во 2007 година, кога Германија председаваше со Европската унија, и кога мислењето на одредени политички, не знам какви се авторитети беше, не мора да притискаме баш да почнат преговорите. 2007. Што би било кога би било, не е благодарно да се дискутира дури на вакви дебати, меѓутоа таа изгубена шанса тогаш да направиме повеќе притисок, бидејќи се уште нашиот файл изгледаше многу добро. Пропуштањето на таа шанса ја олесни само работата на Хрватска, бидејќи беше една и единствена. А нас ни ги отвори после тоа раните со 2008, со НАТО и да не зборувам се останато. Така што кога зборуваме за моментум, кога зборуваме за тајминзи, можеби големите држави можат да си дозволат, за нив ќе се создаде тајминг. За малите држави не се создава тајминг. За малите држави самите си ја создаваат шансата. И толку патем речено, навистина сметам дека прв пат после долго време француската позиција е доволно значително променета. Ако предходно стравот од проширување беше проширувањето значи слабење на унијата, не сакаме урбанизација на Европската унија, сега веќе имате реченици од типот стратешки sovereignty, сувереноста е невозможна без Западен Балкан во Европска унија. И повторно, тоа нема да трае вечно. И ќе биде на маса, додека на маса е оваа геополитичка карта. Втората тема е, по мене, тема која треба во повеќе детали меѓу нас да ја зборуваме. Пред една недела бев на конференција на слична тема во Белград, повеќе со европски фактори, помалку со регионални. Таму сакам да зборувам за тоа што се нашите очекувања од нив. И има многу критики кои мора со право да ги пишеме. Меѓутоа, кога сме во Скопје, кога сме во регионот, кога зборуваме меѓу нас, не треба да ни биде прашањето what have you done for me lately, него што самите правиме за да си помогнеме. И она што е исто во Солун и денес, 20 години, е дека фокусот и тогаш пораките беа домашни реформи, домашни задачи. Ама тогаш домашните задачи беа сосема различни. И тоа на некој начин зборува за прогрес во регионот. Во 2003 темата за Македонија беше Охридски рамковен договор, човекови права, враќање на полицијата во одредени региони во државата, нов закон за децентрализација. На овие теми веќе нема дискусија. И тоа е плюс, дека на некои теми сме созреале и сме понудиле резултати. Меѓутоа, факт е дека реформите не само кај нас, меѓутоа особено кај нас, се во втор план заради две многу видливи причини. Една е геополитиката и второ се билатералните спорови. Ако премногу зборуваме дека геополитичката состојба ни оди на рака, секој политичар, експерт, граѓанин ќе рече, па еде геополитиката нека ни ја заврши работата. Колку и да се трудиме или не се трудиме, ако има геополитичка одлука за проширување, ќе влеземе. Што мислам дека е опасно и погрешно. Но постои. Затоа што сме виделе периоди кога заради политички размислувања и добрите резултати не се ценеле. И тоа мислам дека е хендикеп. И вториот хендикеп се билатералните прашања. Вие денеска било која дискусија за ЕУ поврзани реформи, која нема да зборува за уставните промени, ќе биде одмолчана, незабележана и прескокната. И јас мислам дека ова се сериозен хендикеп за процесот. Впечатокот на сите домашни фактори е дека прогресот и со домашни реформи не се цени особено многу, а пак било какво назадување не се ни казнува. И во регионот, и кај нас. И како сите лоши студенти, ние го сваќаме тоа на начин кој што на крај нам ни се удира од глава. Европската Унија долго време не е надворешно политичка цел. Таа од почетокот е домашна политика. Ама додека беше многу силен аргументот ЕУ, тој можеше многу силно да се бори против различни интереси во општеството. И во европските општества постојат различни политички штетни интереси, бизнис интереси, корупцијски интереси, постојат и кај нас. И многу кога ЕУ аргументот е силен, полесна е битката. Кога ЕУ аргументот е слаб, тешко ни оди битката. И тие така наречени vested интерес стануваат помоćни од европската агенда или стануваат помоćни од европскиот интерес. По мене ни треба дефинитивно и дома и во комуникација со ЕУ да направиме одредено свртување. И јас ќе кажам неколку примери каде тоа би требало да се движи. Прво, по прашањето на билатералните теми. Сега се тоа уставните измени. Утре ќе биде нешто друго. Сега е Бугарија, утре може да биде помеѓу Србија и Хрватска. По мене, особено кога е земја членка во прашање, мислам дека веќе не смееме да си го дозволиме луксузот Европската Унија да не биде на масата. Кога Северна Македонија денеска преговара со Бугарија на било која тема, ние седиме како две земји членки, ама во мускулите на бугарската страна се ЕУ стероиди. И тоа е нерамноправна битка. Заради тоа што тие го имаат аргументот на ЕУ. И се додека седиме сами на масата, тоа не е поизедначено, напротив. Тоа е по неизедначена е битката. Сметам дека и на темата на односите помеѓу Северна Македонија и Бугарија, и Европската Унија, и ние треба да бидеме заинтересирани за учество на масата. Најголемиот дел од темите ќе бидат сензитивни теми. Тие може нема да бидат дополнителни услови од овој тип како уставните, но ќе бидат на масата. Историја, учебници, култура и така натаму. Не постои ни еден успешен модел во Европската Унија кој што не значил присуство и на експерти од Совет на Европа, УНЕСКО, од така наречени трети експертски страни кои што ќе ни помогнат да бидеме и порационални, да бидеме и подолгорочни во нашето функционирање. Значи, знам дека ниту ЕУ ова не го посакува, ниту Бугарија, во одредена мерка можеби и некои луѓе кај нас дома имаат дилеми, меѓутоа сметам дека веднаш потоа учеството на Европската Унија на масата во разговорите ќе биде важен. Второ, на тема на уставните измени, мислам дека слонот во собата не можеме да го избегнуваме. На тема на уставните измени со сите минуси и резерви, сметам дека не треба да дозволиме да си создадеме автоимуна болест. Како викаат, автоимуна болест е болест која што практично твојот организам го тера да те уништува однатре. Значи, блокирањето на уставните измени само ќе ја пресели за секогаш вината која не е кај нас, ама ќе дојде кај нас на македонски терен. И посакувам да се создаде мнозинство за уставни измени, затоа што во суштина Северна Македонија беше таа која што пред известно време даде предлог до бугарската страна да влезат бугарите во преамбулата. Бугарските националисти го одбија Затоа што сметаа дека со ваква измена на уставот ќе се покаже дека бугарите и македонците се два различни народа. И јас тоа така го гледам. И затоа бугарските националисти пред неколку години тоа го одбија. Може сега да водиме дискусија зашто го смениле мислењето. Не е ни битно. Битно е дека во суштина оваа промена на еден многу либерален устав, кој е многу широк за различни етнички заедници, што е плюс за нас, треба да ја направиме. А ако постои страв, како што чувме дека постои, дека после тоа блокадата може да дојде од исто место, но со друга природа, мислам дека е можно некој наместо измени во уставните амандмани кои што би стапиле на сила накнадно, што мислам дека тешко ќе помине во ЕУ, мислам дека политичките партии можат слободно да седнат на маса и да се договорат дека ако процесот после 2 години сватиме дека е замрзнат од истите причини, како што се сменил уставот, може да се смени назад. И велам, ни треба политички договор, затоа што партиите помеѓу себе немаат верба. Меѓутоа, со политички договор кој што ќе биде јавен и јасен, тоа е, знаете како реверзибилноста на ЕУ процесот. Ни веруваат дека ќе одиме напред, ама имаат и една опција што ако не одиме напред. ЕУ политиките може да се применат и дома. Сакам да упатам уште еден апел на тема реформи, а тоа е повеќе кон Европската Унија. Одличната иницијатива која датира, ако не се лажам, од 2018 или 2019, а тоа е за мониторирање на судските предмети, сензитивни, политички и така натаму, мора да почне. И не верувам дека таа треба да се децентрализира од ЕУ со тоа што ќе им се даде на локални актери. Не заради тоа што немаме такви. Јас мислам дека кај нас има капацитети мониторинг да се направи на вистински на добар начин. Меѓутоа, гледам дека во некои земји после тоа тие стануваат лошите вештарки. И тоа не треба да го правиме. Позитивното искуство од Прибе комисијата, Прибе извештајот, кој што на вистина еден период беше Библија во државата, Куран, Библија, како сакате да бидам политички коректна, ако функционирал, треба повторно да се искористи. И тоа мислам дека час поскоро треба да биде притисок врз институциите, особено притисок врз судската власт, која се прогласи како власт сама за себе и неприкосновена, да не даваме шанси тоа да го прави извршната власт. Дадеме шанси тоа да се прави под притисок на јавноста и под објективното око на Европската Унија. На крај, дозволете ми да завршам со една реченица која што мислам дека Шарл Мишел, председателот на Европскиот совет, ја кажа негдека средина 2022 година, кога кажа дека европскиот интегративен процес треба да биде побрз, постепен и повратен. Проблемот кај нас дома и проблемот во регионот е дека изгубивме вербата во сите три. Дали може да биде побрз, дали на вистина постепено можеме да напредуваме и дали ако правиме нешто лошо, дали ќе биде реверзибилен. За сите три теми, заради искуствата во регионот, многу скепса се создаде. Мислам дека затоа ни е потребно обновување на таа верба, која што мора да го градиме дома, а од страна на Европската Унија изјава од типот на оние дадени во 90-тите, дека очекуваме членство за оние кои ќе завршат својата домашна задача до 2030-та, мислам дека може да биде јазикот на вагата, кој што ќе им помогне и на проевропските сили, и на прореформските сили, меѓутоа и на институциите, да го дадат максимумот кој често пати од недоверба не го даваат. Благодарам.
Благодарам. Ms. Uvalic, we could hear that the European integration of the Western Balkans is taking place in new geopolitical context now, and it's taking place, it's reshaping this new geopolitical context, it's reshaping Europe's role in the neighborhood and possibly redesigning the setup in the Union. And with this new geopolitical context and new developments, also economic support for the Western Balkans has come to the forefront. In this sense, I want to ask you, what do you think that are the current needs and emerging needs for the Western Balkan countries? And did the EU do enough, in a sense?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to say how happy I am to be in Skopje with old friends and colleagues and discussing very important issues, because EU enlargement is back. There is a new momentum, and I think it should be really utilized in the best possible way. Now, this session is dedicated to the achievements of these 20 years. And I do want to start with an optimistic statement. We have to realize that, in fact, a lot has been achieved in these 23 years, a bit more. It was not only Thessaloniki, it started some years earlier. And we see that, in fact, the fact that the EU offered technical support, financial support, immediately a trade opening for the autonomous trade preferences, later on for the stabilization and association agreements, have really opened certain paths for all the countries. And it was extremely important at that time. And for the first time, in fact, what was announced was the possibility for the Western Balkan countries to become EU members. And this was, well, at least for some countries, it was revolutionary, perhaps not for Macedonia at that time, but Macedonia was in a different situation. And of course, these processes actually led to a very strong integration, economic integration between the Western Balkan countries and the European Union. And not only, and of course, the financial assistance and everything that the European Union has done was extremely important. Now, the process of economic integration clearly stands in sharp contrast with the political process, because we see that, in fact, after so many years, only one country was able to join the European Union, Croatia, in 2013. And there is, especially today, a lot of disappointment. We're often hearing about reform fatigue, we're listening about enlargement fatigue, etc. But of course, the reality is much more complicated. We know that each country has been facing specific problems, and somehow we are very disappointed today. But still, from the point of view of economic integration, I think that a lot has been done, and we've really moved forward. So what went wrong? Of course, many things could be debated here. Also, we should remember that although after 2000, we did not have military conflicts in the, well, after 2001, we did not have military conflicts in the region. We did have substantial political instability. If we think of a country like the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, there was a transformation into the Union of Serbia and Montenegro, and then separation between the two, and then the Kosovo Declaration of Independence, and so on. And at the same time, of course, the EU has faced quite a few crises, not only the financial economic crisis, but then there was the Eurozone crisis, there was the migration crisis, then we had the COVID pandemic, now we have this terrible situation provoked by the war in Ukraine, by the attack of Russia against Ukraine. And regarding the strong economic integration that I was emphasizing, I think that also there somehow the fact that these countries have become integrated into the EU economy has not really substantially contributed to removing some of the structural weaknesses of these economies. And I think we should really reflect on why this is so, because somehow there were too optimistic expectations that the arrival of donors' aid, that the arrival of foreign investors and so on would really bring economic development. This does not happen in Macedonia as in Serbia and the other countries. So the expectations were far too optimistic. And so if we look at the latest figures on GDP per capita of these countries, we see that in fact, well, Montenegro is the most developed country according to 2022 statistics. It's reached 50% of the average GDP per capita that we have in the European Union. But if you look at the last 10 years, you will notice that somehow most countries have stagnated. It's not that, but there's been a lot of progress. And so there are quite a few reasons for concern. So what are the needs of the Western Balkans today? I would say that the needs, it was the question you had asked me, the needs are really enormous. And I think here we can look at the recent plan that was proposed by the European Commission, the recent economic and investment plan, which really does take into account the most important needs of the region. It lists some 10 flagship projects which should have priority, which are certainly in line with also EU priorities. And these are the enormous needs of the region. But at the same time, if we look at what has been endorsed so far until a few months ago, until February 2023, through the Western Balkan Investment Framework, we will see that in fact, there has been a very strong bias towards infrastructure projects and fortunately energy. But this has happened recently precisely because of the energy crisis we have been facing. So somehow all the other areas, there are 6 thematic areas, for example, environment and climate, surprisingly has not attracted many investors. Human resources, digitalization, certain areas have not at all been interesting for the investors. And so we worry, where will the money come from? How are these projects going to be financed? And where will the money be found? Because of course the Western Balkan governments have very limited budgets. Now, this is an issue that we could discuss at length, because in fact, the Western Balkan countries may be better off regarding fiscal balances in comparison with some of the EU member states. And they have been additionally pressed by the new economic reform programs, which very much follow the fiscal situation in the countries. So they have very little money to finance projects which require co-financing. So it is a problem. I don't see how this can be easily resolved. And we also see a problem regarding public administration capacity, because if you we've been hearing a lot about raising the EU budget, well, the money coming from the EU, and this was also von der Leyen's messages just recently, but somehow we need to be sure that the money, if more money arrives, that it will be absorbed. And therefore, I think there is really a need to work much more on the reform of the public administration within ministries, and especially regarding these new areas which have become so important: climate change, the environment, energy, decarbonization. These are all so important priorities, and I don't think that any of the ministries really have the capacity to prepare so-called mature projects, because now, according to the strictest rules that are being introduced, all the projects that will be financed will need to be mature, fully mature, and therefore complying with a set of conditions and so on. And that is why I think it is really very, very important that each of the countries does rely on the civil society organization that they have, because many of these civil society organizations, NGOs, are really more knowledgeable about problems of the environment, problems of climate change, and so on, precisely because they some of these problems are dealing with problems of the citizens, of the population, and so on. So although it is there in the EPA 3 regulations, somehow it has not been used sufficiently. So I think the NGO sector must be involved much more. Yes, I would like to end here for the moment, and then, of course, I'll be glad to go on and answer.
Thank you, Professor Willage. Sergio, now I'm turning to you. So the EU activity in the Western Balkans, the perception is, and some of the analysis show that the US activity has been ineffective at generating support for the domestic reforms that are necessary for accession. And as a result, people do not consider the EU to be a credible partner. So how can we evaluate the EU's activity in the Western Balkans? And is EU really a credible partner?
Thank you very much for this question. And first of all, allow me to thank our host, the EPI, for inviting us to this discussion to address the past 20 years. It's very difficult to be the last speaker in the panel because obviously the two colleagues covered pretty much everything I wanted to say. But as the famous replica goes, these things were not said by me, so you will have to listen to me as well. When you talk about credibility, I think it is very important to define the term. And one of the definitions that I found very interesting is that credibility is capacity for belief. Do we have the belief, do we have a capacity to believe that we did everything we were supposed to on both sides of the story? And this is the crucial question. And I think that led to basically a lack of capacity to trust to each other on both sides of the table, unfortunately. We heard by Ambassador Geer, by all my previous colleagues, what crisis the EU was going through ever since, I would say, 2008 and start of the financial crisis, and then everything else developed. In these circumstances, it was obvious that the EU is going to focus on internal reforms. At the same time, 20 years ago, there is a sentence in a joint declaration which says the place of the Western Balkans is within the EU. I'm afraid that on our behalf of a table, we forgot this sentence and we forgot what it means. And it means that we were ready to do everything in our power to bring our countries at a level of institutional, legal, economic, social development similar to the one within the EU. Unfortunately, the lengthiness of the process led us to become preoccupied with the different, very often nationalistic agendas, both in the EU, and this is best felt in this country that we are currently in, where European agenda was nationalized by neighboring countries. And I fully agree with Radmila. Maybe that was not the last time. We also have neighbors in Serbia who even adopted the declarations in their parliaments that they're not going to use and abuse their position as a member state with regards the enlargement process. But you know, we are 20 years wiser, I would say, and it would be very naive to think that a declaration would stop someone to abuse the membership position. Unfortunately, this impasse in the EU integration process led the doors open for some other partners in the region. Unfortunately, Serbia is the best case, which proves that if there is no visible goal in sight, that there will be some other partners who are willing to to come and invest. Obviously, they're going to bring their own business habits. They're going to bring their own business rules. And most probably they're going to play a very significant role in nurturing the corruption and everything else that it goes with their interests. In that sense, eroding the possibility of our societies to fight with these negative concepts in accordance with the rule of law. The EU integration process itself has changed. In the previous wave of enlargement, the European Commission was in the leading seat. So it was a process that was led to the European Commission by the member states, because member states had a full political understanding and capacity and consensus to say, this is our strategic goal. So the expert services of the European Commission should do everything they can in order to help the candidates to bring these countries closer to the membership. Today's situation is different. Today, member states are predominantly in charge of the EU integration process. And in these circumstances, unfortunately, the European Commission lacks capacities, however, funny that might sound, but this is the case. And this is one of the consequences of 2014 and the previous president of the European Commission saying there will be no enlargement in the foreseeable future. The capacities of the line directorate generals of, if you wish, ministries of the European Commission have eroded. And the first one who lost their capacities were units for enlargement. It's very difficult in the previous couple of years to find a well-functioning, fully equipped units on enlargement, for example, in, I don't know, the Directorate General for Agriculture or some other very important EU policy that is supposed to help us in this process. So I would say no wonder that there is a lack of credibility. And unfortunately, it was up to the Russian rockets and tanks that this strategic interest within the EU for projecting its territorial scope was rediscovered. It took a war in the middle of Europe in order to reinvent the importance and reimagine the importance of the enlargement. And I will address this in the last point. The second point was, is there an alternative to this process? As in everything you do in your life, there's always an alternative. The problem is whether this alternative fits your exact needs and interests. And I would say that there is no alternative, and I fully support what Deputy Prime Minister said. Whatever the methodologies and ways how to get countries closer to the EU accession, we should never settle for less than what was promised 20 years ago. And that was a full-fledged membership within the EU. And that should be always in our sight. Obviously, the European political community, Berlin process are very useful vehicles, but these are not substitutes for the goal, and the goal is the EU membership. And finally, we have witnessed the revised methodology of how to bring candidates closer to the EU. I'm afraid that at this moment, we still do not have answers on two very important questions. One is how, and the second is exactly when. So, I mean, to say, do we need a new integration map? I would say that it's a rhetorical question. It is obvious that we are failing to produce results using the existing tools in the previous 20 years, which are currently at our disposal. We need an open and frank conversation on common future. It's not only about the Western Balkans, it's a common future. The EU cannot practice its strategic autonomy in its relationship with the other global powers without projecting its territorial integrity and integrating the Western Balkans in the EU. I'm mentioning Western Balkans, but obviously the waiting room is getting bigger and there are Ukraine and Moldova, obviously, and potentially Georgia as well. So we need to address this issue. How do we see our future? And Olaf Scholz recently said, we need more Europe. And this is an answer. We need more Europe in this region as well. And we need to address our bilateral issues as well. I'm coming from a country which has backslided in the process, during the process of the EU accession. And it's a very, very important example how things can go in a different way, regardless of rhetorical dedication to the EU integration process. So this is no time for complacency, because, as I said, the window of opportunity, which was opened by Russian tanks, is not going to be here forever. I'm afraid that not many people and decision makers in this region are aware of that. This is something that needs to be repeated. Now, it's obvious that EU's ability to build its own place in the multipolar uncertainty of today's world is closely linked with the destiny of this region and its ability to project its own values and resolve the issues in its inner backyard. So we are intertwined in our interests to be successful, and still we don't have answers, as I say, on two questions: how and when, and how. My organization in Belgrade, European Policy Center, together with our colleagues in Brussels, Center for European Policy Studies, we developed the way how to make the revised methodology actually productive. We need to have in place a method that will send a welcoming message to newcomers. We need to fight for hearts and souls in our region because of lack of credibility, because of lack of capacity of belief. In Serbia today, half of our population does not believe that Serbia will ever become EU member state. I'm afraid to say that in Macedonia, numbers are not similar, not closely, but they are declining in the same way. And this is a serious risk. We need to feel the benefits of the future membership in an early stage of the EU accession process. And this is what we offered in our example, both in the institutional sense, by including candidates in the work of different institutions on a guest basis first, but then to integrate them slowly in the policymaking process, as well as by enabling more economic convergence, what Professor Ulic was saying, by enabling more substantive and more strategic, I would say, structural investments and support in the region. And we also need more sophisticated and precise methods of scrutiny of the candidates, because it's not everything about giving on behalf of the EU. In order to achieve the principles more for more or less for less, we need to invent more sophisticated instruments how to measure exact progress achieved in the candidate countries, and thus build the credibility when we set. And finally, the second question: when? I mean, whatever you plan in your life, the component of time is always present. So please be aware, be vigilant, and continuously demand time for the accession of our region to the EU. We need when? 2030, why not? We need time as a sort of a horizon that will enable us to focus on these difficult issues and challenges that we still need to address. But we also need a time to be able to work together on the retaining or rather return of the credibility. So thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Serjan. Before opening the floor for discussion, I have a follow-up question for Ms. Shekerinska. And there is a perception that the political elites in the Western Balkans have learned to use the EU narrative to secure EU funds while having no real intention to do the domestic reforms. In this sense, fast-tracking Ukraine did also not help because it showed there is a disappointment in the Western Balkans as the process was not merit-based, but it was a political decision. And how do you see this reflect how to lock reforms in this kind of situation where we deal more with political decisions than with merit-based process?
No, that's the old and the new dilemma, and I spoke about this. It was Chatham House rules when I was in Belgrade, and one of the participants, one of the most experienced EU, let's say, officials that I have met, he said, you know, we have to stop playing games. We played the games from the EU side, but also you played the games very well, and you know, we all agreed. After a while, I remember, if you go back and you check the beginning of, I don't know, the decline of media freedoms in Macedonia, and you check the reports around those events, you will see that the EU was lagging behind. Why? In most cases, it's great intentions. You know, the people who are doing the reports don't want to give ammunition to member states saying that the countries from the Western Balkans are not performing. So they're basically trying to convince us to change course before they issue very strict or damning or harsh statements. But unfortunately, it has backfired. And, you know, practically this behavior has empowered autocrats, it has empowered nationalists, and it always ended up with having a deplorable state of domestic affairs. So I believe that the old policy, we were warned about the old European Commission being very strict but fair. And I have to say, after so many difficult meetings with the European Commission of that time, it was a correct assessment, very strict. I mean, some of our meetings would be exhausting. In most cases, they wouldn't be convinced by our words. But whenever we would deliver, there would have been genuine appreciation and criticism in areas where we were not. So I really think we have to go beyond the technical assessments, the ticking of boxes, whatever it is. We are now in a territory where laws are never enough. Bylaws, hardly. Trainings, we have trained enough people. Is there a political will? Is there delivery? And on these things, there has to be more creativity. And I think the European Union should be less worried about making a mistake. They have to be bold again. And we have to know this. There was my real worry is that while these games continue in the Balkans, it will be predominantly Game of Thrones. It will be who takes over and who solidifies rule. And then if we allow ourselves to find ourselves in the same situation, there won't be any remedy, neither in the hands of the EU nor in our hands as citizens. I think that on issues such as administration, the EU and the countries in the region have to come up with more practical and creative solutions. Let me now think very small, let's say. We are giving so much money to so many consultant agencies, not we, actually, EU taxpayers are giving a lot of EU money to a lot of consultancy to explain what's wrong. And then we end up giving some money to institutions to buy equipment, to do training. But why can't we be a bit bolder and say that the EU will also have a chunk of money to pay extra to civil servants, basically through our budget or separately, for civil servants who will go through a certain kind of EU additional training and testing, so that we can keep some of the good ones, because most of them actually go and work for EU projects. So they're not in the institutions, they are supporting the EU PED, but they're weakening the small human resources left in this country and throughout the region. I'm just naming examples, but this, I think that practically we are cutting the link to the institutions that we consider very important. Finally, let me also say that I'm appalled, I'm frightened that the issue of convergency might actually turn for the worst, because the region is hardly aware of some of the discussions and some of the policy making in the European Union when it comes to, for example, green transition. So how can we expect that our countries will be prepared and with the money and with the policies for what happens in 3 or 2 years? We will be caught off guard. We will be shocked, unprepared, not having the money, not having the capacity, not having the knowledge for the policies. This is why I believe that although at first this whole story about participation at certain council meetings on certain policies, I thought it's just politicians going to yet another meeting in Brussels. And I don't think that it will. Actually, I am reconsidering my views. Our businesses are not aware of some of the legislation that will affect their business just next year. Carbon tax, things like this. Our policymakers are not aware of where the policy in some of these domains will go. So including the countries in at least some of the councils, some of the committees, some of the preparatory meetings, I think it's essential for making these countries still capable of policy development. Otherwise, we will just lag and delay and see that actually what was supposed to be a convergence actually turns into a divergence. We are focused very much on the change in the voting patterns in the EU. It is interesting, but it will be very difficult. As a vice president of the Party of European Socialists, I'm participating in the discussions on the Socialists and Democrats platform prior to 2024. And they have included this provision that they will be in favor of introducing, the qualified majority voting when it comes to foreign policy, including enlargement. But even on the left side of the spectrum, you have several countries and parties who are opposing it. So it's still far-fetched. So we cannot count that, okay, we might wait for few years until the EU changes its voting pattern. I think it's short-sighted, dangerous, and very, very damaging.
Thank you, Ms. Wallich. There is a lot of misperception of how much the EU is doing through EU funds. How can we change this perception? And will actually the latest initiative country of Ursula von der Leyen with the 4-pillar plan actually will contribute in a major way of economic development of the region? Because we always say we needed more money. Is that the right way?
I didn't actually mention some of the figures, but on trade integration, but it's been since 2008 that the Western Balkans have the European Union as the main trading partner. And not only, but financial assistance. If you look at the list of development assistance, if you look at the official figures, you will see that the European Union and its institutions are also the main donor to the region. Plus you have bilateral aid. You have Germany, which is very important for its bilateral financial assistance, but then other countries like Sweden and so on. Actually, there are quite a few donors, and this is not sufficiently recognized. It's not sufficiently known in the region. It's especially not known among the citizens. So I think that this is an extremely important issue that should be on the one hand also handled by the EU in a better way by having a better communication strategy. I think that perhaps more could be done, because if the EU is the main trading partner, if it's the country, if it is the main donor of financial assistance, the citizens have to know that. And I'm surprised to see how much ignorance there is still today about these amounts. So the EU has to develop a much better communication strategy. But of course, looking at the Western Balkan countries, of course, unfortunately, the media in all the countries are still are what they are. So it is a major responsibility of the policymakers, of the politicians, if not the top politicians, at least people who are involved in the EU integration process, to explain everything that the EU has been doing. It's their responsibility, and I think that knowing more about what EU is doing also for everyday lives of citizens. There are so many programs where citizens can actually benefit from. So I think much more could be done in this area.
Thank you. And Sergeant, my last question for you, and then I'll give it to the floor. Do we really need 2030 as a date from the European Union? Can't we do it ourselves until then? All the reforms and then see where it takes us?
Well, listen, you can have the most beautiful paper and strategy written, the most beautiful strategy in the world. If there is no political commitment, it's not going to happen. The problem of today's world, of today's Europe, is that we still lack the trust that this is going to happen. And in order to make it happen, my idea was to sign a common agreement or understanding or convention, call it whatever you want, on a common future by 2030. In order to commit ourselves on both sides to the goal, and this is a united Europe, in a certain time frame, like it was in the case of the previous wave of enlargement, when there was an Agenda 2000. Guess what? Nobody joined EU in 2000. But there was a clear vision and the time horizon towards which the governments of these countries could focus and focus their efforts to adjust and to change their societies. This is why we need the date. Is it going to be 2030 or 2033 or 2030, whatever? I don't care. But this is important strategic compromise and agreement on European future. We are witnessing the counteroffensive of Ukrainian forces in these days. We don't know how it's going to end. We don't know what is going to be the outcome of this war. And if you tell me that there is no need for a strategic coherence within Europe to address these future challenges, whether the war ends with the win of Ukraine or Russia, we're going to have to live with Russia. We're going to have to live with China. We're going to have to live with the US as well. We don't know who is going to be the next president. And if the EU does not recognize the importance, strategic importance of projection of its territorial integrity in order to deal with these challenges, I rest my case. We are not serious enough, as Ms. Shekerinska said. We need to be very serious. We need to be brave. We need to have vision of the world that we are going to live in the next 20 years. So we need a common agreement. We need a common document where we are going to say we are going to do our share of work. For example, Kosovo and Serbia will resolve their differences. Bosnia will resolve its internal structural issues. Macedonia will address its bilateral issues with their neighbors. And the EU is going to prepare institutionally, but also they're going to prepare their public for the future EU, which is going to be a bit different than it is today. So in that side of a communication agenda that Ms. Uvalic mentioned, we need more effort. And I'm very sorry that the ambassador just left, but we need more commitment on behalf of the EU member states to communicate the strategic importance of the future enlargement for the common good. So yeah, you can put whatever number it is, but rest assured that this paper and this date is going to be assessed both in Moscow, in Beijing, in New Delhi, in Washington, and all over the world. It's about strategic seriousness of the EU. Are you serious enough to be a grown-up player in the world arena, or are you still just an economic giant and political dwarf? So this is the importance of this strategic agreement on the future of Europe.
Thank you, Serjan. And now I'm opening the floor for discussion. You can pose your question in whichever language you want. There is translation.
Фала многу на сите говорници, стварно бевте многу инспиративни, ама ќе ми дозволите едно прашање имам за Шекеринска. Кратко, што подразбирате под нов политички договор? Многу ми се виде интересно тоа што го кажавте, меѓутоа не го довршивте, па би сакала малку повеќе да слушнам за тоа. Фала.
Дали може да соберам уште две прашања ако има? Повели, Симонида.
Фала ви. И сите го допресте прашањето на административниот капацитет и новите пари кои што ги бараме. Ако евентуално имате некои идеи за тоа како би можеле овие две работи да бидат на ист колосек, бидејќи во моментот аргументите ни идат во различна насока и нам ни е многу тешко кога ги презентираме од наша страна, бидејќи се судруваме со зид. Фала ви.
Дали повели?
Здраво на сите, јас сум Валентин Мешовски, PR и communication експерт. И бидејќи панелистите овде си зборуваат за комуникација, ме поттикна да земам збори репликата која повтори господинот Мајсторовиќ на Олаф Шолц, тоа е дека we need more Europe. Би сакал малце увертира да дам, јас се чувствувам овдека ветеран на европскиот процес и препознавам повеќе лица овдека кои сме бидели полого во овој процес. Почнав како новинар, уредник во повеќе важни македонски вестници, продолжив во секретаријатот за европски прашања заедно со господјата Шекеринска, со Малинка и така натака, потоа во ЕУ делегацијата, а сега независен експерт. Оно што сакав да ги кажам е провела една атмосфера на 20 години од Солунот во самитот во Солун, која е тешка атмосфера, бидејќи се чувствуваме неуспешни. Меѓутоа, треба да се подсетиме на една друга работа. Мислам дека во однос на комуникациите, PR експертите си ја вршат добро работата. Бидејќи не видов никаде во регионов, а работев секаде во регионов, поддршката за ЕУ да падне под 55-56%. И покрај сите турбуленции, превирање и така натаму. Главната порака ми е дека всушност има плодна почва да се работи, бидејќи народот дава поддршка за оваа приказна. Мислам дека политичките елити треба да ја препознаат и да играат на таа карта, а не да играат на други карти. Прашањето ми е, за да завршаме, дали се согласувате со оваа теза, во смисол дека навистина има плодна почва во регионот, каде што луѓето сакаат Европската унија. И мислам дека таа почива на едни вредности елементи кои се многу важни, а тоа се солидарност, соработка, иднина добра и така. Ви благодарам.
Благодарам, Валентин. Now I will turn to the panel, Ms. Шекеринска.
Ајде да почнам поред. Измените на Уставот дојдоа најблиску што дојдовме до промена на Уставот после лидерската средба, кога стана јасно да, во принцип партиите би можеле, двете најголеми, сега ќе кажам, би можеле да се согласат да гласаат за вметнување на бугарите заедно со другите во преамбулата, ама барањето од опозицијската партија беше тој член, односно тој амандман во Уставот да стапи на сила од моментот на членство на Македонија во ЕУ. И аргументот кој не можеше да се каже, го подразбираме, стравот е дека бугарите или некој друг повторно може да го блокира процесот во некоја следна епизода. Ако е, знаете како во теоријата на преговори велат вака, ако имаш два става, мора да ги разбереш причините и ако причината е кажана јавно, треба да најдеш можеби некое решение кое што практично дава одговор на двете. Од една страна на власта, која што вели преговарачката рамка е таа, односно council conclusions се такви, тука тешко дека ќе пројде одредба која што ќе стапи на сила тогаш кога ќе станеме членка на Европската унија. Јас велам, ако е стравот дека нешто сме направиле, а не сме добиле ништо во возврат, паралелно со уставните измени, може главните политички партии, јас тогаш би рекла 4-5 најголеми, да подпишат политички договор помеѓу нив и да излезат во јавност и да кажат како што го сменивме уставот и ги вградивме бугарите и другите етнички заедници во уставот како дел од овој пакет, утре, доколку Бугарија не се однесува in good faith negotiations, пошто продолжуваат, овој устав може да претрпи, не изгледа политички многу атрактивно, да би малку е неубаво, ама ако врши работа, и тоа е предлог кој што може да се дискутира. Да влезат сите со тоа дека навистина нема да играат војни игри. Ја велам, за држава која што рекла сите значајни етнички заедници ќе ги ставам во преамбулата и од тоа ќе правам еден поинаков концепт за водење на држава, ова малку и не личи. Ама, ако е тоа цената за да ги завршиме уставните измени, мислам дека и тоа не е многу лош предлог. Знаете како? Ако веќе одам и велам зошто бугарите прифатија нешто, не, зошто бугарите побараа нешто што претходно одбија. Пошто е навистина чудно да ја анализирате ситуацијата. Единствен аргумент кој мене ми паѓа на ум е дека предолго им беше топката во нивната половина на теренот, веќе почнаа да плаќаат одредена EU политичка цена и најдоа начин како топката да ја вратат назад во нашиот терен, да играат на наша грешка. Двотретински мнозинства во секоја држава се многу тешки. Уставна измена е секогаш. Зошто они да се мачат да објаснуваат зашто го блокираат проширувањето, кога можат да ја префрлат топката и да кажете сами сега сте си криви. Значи, стварно мислам дека искрено не сум многу оптимист. И мислам дека ќе направиме стратешка грешка. И ќе им дадеме алиби на сите оние кои што не сакаат ние да станеме членки или да ги продолжиме преговорите, или не сакаат и регионот многу напред да оди. Мојата теза уште пред 2 години беше дека одредени политики во Софија навистина мислам дека беа направени под диктат на Москва. Ама не мора и ние да влеземе во играта. Значи, тоа беше моето мислење. Вториот коментар околу парите. Истиот проблем го имаме сите ние. Кога велиме дајте ни пристап до кохезионите фондови, они велат целиот регион не може да си ги искористи своите пари. Меѓутоа, знаете како, и тоа што немаме пристап до кохезионите фондови, создава внатрешно алиби, дека нема зашто да ствараме ние капацитет за кохезиони фондови. Утре ќе станеме членка, уште помалку ќе ги користиме парите. Мислам дека ни треба, слично како што некој Срđan ми се чини спомна, ни треба двостран договор. Европската унија која што ќе го превземе комитментот за пристап, времен, постепен пристап на одреден процент во кохезионите фондови, а ние од друга страна ќе мора да понудиме нешто повеќе од зборот дека ќе бидеме подобри. Нам стварно ни треба повторно ќе кажам, многу страдаме од во колотечина. Ќе влеземе и малку дека ќе подобруваме. Ни требаат малку и големи идеи. Дајте скроз да го отвориме прашањето каква ќе ни биде администрацијата која што ќе се занимава со европските пари. И апсолутно не мислам дека е невозможно еден дел од EU парите да ги насочиме кон плаќање на тие тимови. Ама тој тим нема да зависи од мене како министер која сака да го почасти мојот колега кој може би врска нема, ама ќе го ставам во тимот. Не, тие да поминат не само соодветен тренинг, соодветни испити, кои што ќе бидат не наши само, затоа што ние паралелно и доверба во тоа треба да создадеме. Не имаме РЕСПА се викаше за Public Administration. Зошто не направиме многу позахтевен како да кажам, тренинг дополнителен, кој што на крај нема да може баш секој што отишол да го помине, а секој кој ќе се врати и ќе работи во овие системи ќе добива екстра плата. И таа екстра плата ќе ја преплатиме од budgetary support која што ќе добие од EU. Значи, знам, многу симплифицирам, ама некогаш комплицирањето е алиби да не сториме ништо. И по мене, дури и парите да останат исти, нам ни треба сериозно преосмислување на администрацијата. И третиот коментар, пред сите да бидеме експерти за пиар, ја не сум, ќе кажам, една од причините зошто Convergence не успева и заради тоа што делови од нашето GDP се одселија у странство. Знаете како, кога еден ќе си замине, фамилијата може би ја чувствува плразнината. Кога ќе си замине волкава голема бројка на луѓе од регионот, GDP-то го чувствуваат. И ние веќе стварно и немаме многу избори. И тоа е проблем. Валентин, јас мислам дека го изгубивме делумно наративот. Да, суштината е дека мнозинството на наши граѓани и во регионот се во суштина про-ЕУ. Дури кога ќе ги анализирате последниве анкети, реакции по моменталните политички теми, ако гребнете под површината, ќе видите дека во суштина тоа се само уморни и наљутени луѓе. А не се луѓе кои што добиле наеднаш инспирација да имаат поинаква ориентација. Но со нив ви треба дупло повеќе работа и дупло повеќе конкретни задачи, конкретни промени кои што ќе се испорачаат. За граѓанин во Македонија, ЕУ е као едно нешто. Сите ние знаеме дека ЕУ е многу работи. ЕУ е и држава која што е не склона кон проширување и држава која што е многу проширување. И Европска комисија, и Европски парламент, ама и Европски совет. Сето тоа е многу комплицирано за јавното мислење. И затоа кога ќе ги чујат различните изјави, тие граѓани не се платени да прават, да ги наоѓаат нијансите помеѓу европските институции, тие велат, на ЕУ не може да и се верува. И сега ние, не постои пиар експерт кој што после преспа и не одлуката ќе може да ви го спаси левериджот. Кај нас во 2019 тоа не се одрази на анкетите. Знаете зошто? Заради тоа што по мене владата го превзема на себе товарот и рече окей, после една година имаме време да сочекаме. Така? Па после дојде ковид без вакцини, па после дојде Бугарија и ние практично го изгубивме, го намаливме и левериджот во Северна Македонија во тие 3 етапи. Нема да ви се предомислат луѓето веднаш. Трпеливи се, после 20 години, барем едно нешто сме докажали дека сме трпеливи и отпојке. Ама проблемот е дека практично сега треба дупло повеќе енергија за да ја вратите. Луѓето се проевропски, но често пати не се јавноста, критичната маса не е спремна да жртвува за нешто што не знаеме кога ќе се случи. Затоа апсолутно се согласувам. Ни треба датум 2030 и не само датум. Ни треба и уште еден преддатум, да биде соопштено, целта ни е 2030. Ке направиме strict but fair assessment во 2026 или 2027, тој што е на добар пат, тој ќе има шанси. Оти, ја не сум за карт бланш. Ако е карт бланш, ние ќе се најдеме во 2030 година во полоша состојба отколку денес. Да не должам, ама прашањата беа многу тешки.
Thank you, Ms. Chegerinska. I am getting signals that we are lagging behind our extended time, but please, for final remarks on the questions.
I wanted to add a few more remarks. In fact, I forgot to address the question of Ursula von der Leyen, her recent proposals. And I think that, of course, it's too early to say anything for now. But of course, of the 4 items, the real novelty is increasing financial resources for the Western Balkans. Of course, it's a different matter how that is going to be done, precisely because what the region is receiving now is extremely little. I mean, if we look at this 9 billion euros investment plan, we see that it represents only 0.45% of the EU budget. So it's less than 0.5% of the EU budget. So definitely the region needs more funding and so on, precisely because during these 7 years, the other countries in the region, including countries like Greece and Hungary and so on, will be receiving 6 to 7 times on a per capita basis in comparison with the Western Balkans. So there's absolutely this big risk of further divergence and not income convergence, what these funds should be securing. Not only, but somehow it's important, in addition to getting more money from the EU, of course, if the administrative capacity of the administrations are weak, how is the additional money going to be used? And even if in the meantime, the public administrations become much more able in complying with all the conditions and so on, the problem is really in how this money is going to be used. I think all countries should really reflect on the type of economic policies that they have been implementing during these 20 years. Somehow, initially, there was too much expected from foreign direct investment and so on. Many things have been done wrongly. It is high time that the countries, that the governments really think about economic development with more strategic thinking and more vision where they want to go towards, and also taking into account the national priorities and so on, and not from one day to another, and therefore much better economic policy, but also industrial policy, especially in the light of the green transition nowadays. I mean, somehow it's something that all the enterprises have to be prepared for. So you need courses, you need somebody who will organize courses to prepare the enterprises to implement it, but also perhaps courses for the banks, for bank officials. They have to know what type of credit should have priority and so on. So there are many issues that need to be addressed, but I think that we have to reflect about much more articulated industrial policy, which would actually bring economic development to the fore. And this has not been done properly so far. So.
Thank you, Professor. And for the end, Serjan, your thoughts and reflections, perhaps on the questions as well, or your final remarks.
Sure. I'll apology to Simonida. I think you heard this one more than once on the money and capacities. I'll start by quoting Marx. You know that I do that in these sessions, but not Karl Marx, but Groucho Marx. And the older of you, you remember Three Stooges and the comedy show. And he famously said, I would like to be a member of a club that would like me as a member. And this is our problem at this stage. When it comes to asking for more resources, this is a legitimate claim, but in return, we need to address the issue and the elephant in the room. And this is that public administration reform is just the other side of the same coin, which is called rule of law. And if our countries are not ready to address the systemic corruption that exists in our societies, I'm afraid that we have no legitimacy to ask for more resources. So the ball is in our yard. We need to make sure that our educational programs, curriculums are in line with the highest standards of OECD countries and Sigma, in order to produce people who are going to be professional, impartial, and who are going to work not for political parties, but for the citizens of our countries. And this is the crux of it. And when we achieve that, we have all the moral rights in the world to go to Brussels and say, we are ready, we want more money because we know how to spend it, and we're going to be responsible and to spend it for the right course. When it comes to the public opinion, I agree. There is a silent majority that is pro-European, but I do not believe to those public polls which are showing, overwhelming support to the EU, 99%, 95, 96, whatever. That's a clear sign that something's wrong, and that the citizens of these societies do not understand what it takes to become an EU member state. So when you have these lower numbers, I think this is a more objective situation where you can adjust the messages regarding the benefits and the costs. You need to address the costs. If you're honest in your communication, you need to address what are the investments that you're willing to make in order to achieve the benefits. But the public opinion depends on information primarily and disinformation. And we are living in the age where this disinformation is very much present by both internal and external actors. And this is, for me, going to be the most serious challenge in the future in the field of communication. And finally, I'm going to finish with something that is perhaps, by the way, you mentioned my quote of Olaf Scholz, we need more Europe. If I would like to complicate the situation even more in this room, I would mention the infamous F word. We need to start talking about possible federalization of Europe as well. And I don't think that many in Europe are ready to address this issue, and let alone whether this is a topic for us. But what is extremely important for perspective of the region is the fact that we need to look ourselves in the mirror. I'm afraid that we are becoming older and smaller, and this is going to have a serious impact on the absorption capacity and our capacities in general to address the challenges of the future and of the EU accession. In case of Serbia, according to the UN, what is the fund for population fund, in 2041, instead of 6.5, we're going to have 5.1 million of inhabitants. Majority of those citizens, inshallah, myself included, at the time, are going to be pensioners. So these are going to be a very old and very conservative societies, which are not going to be ready to engage in a transformative processes for the 100th time in their lives. By the way, 20 years ago, I was one of the contributors to a Serbian position paper that was later presented in Thessaloniki as a junior expert at that time. I left my first boss, Ms. Milica Uvalic, just a couple of months before, because I recognized that the state union of Montenegro and Serbia is not going to last. So I moved to the Republic's government. So yeah, I was much taller, blonder, much better looking 20 years ago. And it's going to be interesting to see how next 20 are going to look like. So on that note, I will just stop here.
So thank you all. I want to close the panel. I won't end more after Sergeant's closing note. I want to thank the panelists for their very important insights and proposals as to what to do next and what to expect next. I want to thank you for the patience and invite you for a short 15 minutes break before we continue with a very this discussion, yes, but we continue with the next one after 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. The people with the stamina remain in the room. We'll now move on to the second panel that looks at the way forward. It seems that everyone was more interested in what we did so far than how we shall proceed. So when we take it to the next 20 years, we make a note of who is in this room. My panelists today will address with me the models and the propositions for how do we actually go forward that have been put on the agenda by civil society, by many of the member states. And we did a similar panel, for those of you that know, also last year in July, to reflect on the various models which are on the agenda as to how do we make enlargement work. I will try to keep this panel short, not more than an hour and 10 minutes, also out of respect to our translators that we've really made their job difficult today. I have with me Jana Juzova from Europeum, Denis Chanusha from the Denis, can you just tell the name? Lithuanian? Can you just tell me the name of the institute so that I don't get it wrong? Is the European Studies Center in Lithuania, and Denis is also a PhD candidate in Germany. And we're very glad to host him for the first time at our conference, because Jana and Jelena were actually here with us also last year. So I think it's a good way to actually reflect on, has anything changed beyond the candidate status? We also have Jelena Jankic from the European University Institute in Florence. I will give each of them about 5 to 7 minutes for introductory words, and then we'll open up for questions. Jana, I would like to ask you also specifically, if you can, to reflect on the many proposals for revising the accession process that have been on the table, possibly a bit on the debates on reforms in the decision-making system of the Union, and maybe to reflect on the Czech presidency now from a bit of a distance that you have. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And for this very timely topic, I would say, because what at least is my perception is that now the enlargement discussion revolves a lot about all these different proposals and concepts on accelerated integration, gradual integration, staged integration, or phasing in general. And I don't want to get too much into details into these different proposals coming from the think tank community. Serjan already mentioned their probably the most elaborate proposal that there is, the staged accession template, which provides also very detailed methodological changes that would need to be made in order to be applied properly and really change the reality of the integration process. But overall, there are either the proposals which propose different stages. So of course this one, and also the well-known one of European Stability Initiative, which is more simplistic in the sense that they introduce one intermediate stage, and that is the access to the single market of the European Union. On the other hand, there are actually other set of proposals coming from the think tank community, the civil society organizations, and they are more focused on the needs of the region in terms of the economic convergence, especially, and aligning with the European standards, which was again a big topic during the previous discussion. And these actually propose different ways how the candidate countries could access larger funds, which are currently dedicated just for the EU member states, precisely for this purpose of boosting the economic convergence, improving basically the lives of and the living standards of the citizens of the Western Balkans before joining of the European Union. And what is probably most important is what the discussion looks like inside the European Union. So first of all, when we talk about the overall context, all these proposals are reacting basically to the new enlargement methodology from 2020. And why they were needed and why there are so many of them, in my opinion, is because we've been lacking some more concrete elaboration of the provisions in the enlargement methodology by the European Commission and by the EU member states. which is also why there were so many, different ideas and suggestions coming from our sphere of work on how to actually turn these provisions, which are already there and they seem promising on paper, into practice. And it's no secret that the Czech EU presidency in autumn last year actually was very active in looking into these different proposals and different ideas. When we talk about institutional integration, so enhancing some cooperation at the institutional level between the EU different bodies, different structures, and the candidate countries, the Czech Republic was perhaps the first one which actually started regularly inviting representatives of the Western Balkan countries to informal ministerial meetings of the EU ministers. In areas of shared interest, such as migration, the foreign policy, obviously, and energy. And this is something that we all hoped would be continued. To my knowledge, it really hasn't been the practice under the Swedish presidency, but hopefully we will see more of this in the future. Still on the note of the institutional integration, there is also a very interesting note in the European Parliament's recommendation for the Commission's new enlargement methodology about involving representatives of the Western Balkan countries, or more generally candidate countries, as observers in the working of not only the European Parliament, but also different agencies and different institutions of the European Union as a whole. So again, this is something that should be ideally more elaborated by the European Commission in very concrete terms, like what are the areas where we can actually include these countries, what exactly would have to be changed on the side of the EU institutions and bodies for this to materialize, and so on. When we talk about sectoral integration, this is perhaps the most imminent topic or area, in my opinion, because what we sometimes forget is that we already have several initiatives, especially in relation to the Western Balkan region, which are supposed to either prepare these countries for future European integration, or they are already integrating them with the EU to some extent. So we have, for example, the Green Agenda for the Western Balkans. We have the energy community, the transport community. We have the most recent example, and the most concrete example was the TEN-T network extension to the Western Balkans. So again, some very concrete example of integrating the region with the European Union. The problem is that there are many different initiatives, basically in different sectors, but what would be probably desirable at this point from the European Commission would be actually to create a comprehensive and detailed analysis of what is already there, defining how we can actually advance the integration in these areas where we already somehow cooperate, and what exactly it would entail, what would be required from each of these countries to actually meet in terms of conditions, and providing some kind of clear roadmaps for each of the countries, because also their starting position might be a bit different. What is also needed is the financial integration. So some solution for how to actually provide the countries, the candidates, with the necessary funds that they need in order to align with the EU standards. Because, and it was mentioned in the first panel, currently the EU member states, the poorer of the EU member states, actually have access to significant funds aimed precisely for this, for basically boosting convergence in their either poorer regions or the countries with the EU average or their richer peers. But for the Western Balkans, we currently have only the instrument for the pre-accession assistance and the economic and investment plan, which again also heavily relies on the IPA. And now we also have this new energy package, which is supposed to actually help the countries deal with the consequences of the energy crisis. We had before the package for helping with the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis, but usually what is actually written in these packages is that they build on the IPA funds, which are already there. So it doesn't necessarily mean increase of the available funding. And this will be a very difficult thing to address. One thing is obviously creating or one way to approach it of some special mechanism for boosting convergence along, basically something in line with the cohesion fund available for the EU member states for the Western Balkans, or some more ambitious proposals actually suggest making the cohesion funds available for the Western Balkan countries. And this is something that will be quite a difficult discussion at the European level. But in the same time, again, what we would need to see more of is actually some guidance from the European Commission in some very clear and concrete terms, not only which direction we could go, but also what exactly it would mean for the EU member states currently, how much, let's say, financial burden it would create for each of them and so on. So actually we can have some factual discussion about it. And also, when we talked about the Ursula von der Leyen speech, what I was actually skeptical about was that when she mentioned the increase of the funding, she was still talking about IPA. So let's see. I was hopeful when I heard Mr. Ambassador mentioning that more details will be coming soon. So of course we will see how exactly it will materialize, but I think we would need to see much more ambitious plan than just working with the instrument that we already have and that proved to be insufficient and maybe not completely suitable because it's still a project-based funding. And when we talk about also the dimension or the discussion among the EU member states, I feel like we are really moving towards more concrete discussion or more tangible, hopefully results on this like concept of gradual integration. Because the enlargement process as such, and we touched upon this before, is actually blocked by the necessity of reforming of the European Union first. Some countries specifically mention it as the precondition for enlargement. Some say it should run in parallel. It should not actually block us from advancing or allowing, let's say, a country which shows progress to advance in the process and so on. But nevertheless, this is a difficult discussion which will take up next few years, in my opinion, to actually solve somehow. And meanwhile, we realize more and more that we actually need to engage the countries of the region, Western Balkans and associated trio as soon as possible in a much more substantial way than we have done so far. And from my experience from Brussels, I have to say that my perception is that the atmosphere among EU member states is actually very positive when we talk about gradual integration. That usually the countries are, or I don't know about any country which would be specifically against, as long as we don't come up with anything too innovative and we stay within the provisions of the enlargement methodology. And yeah, when we talk about the reform and so on, I suppose we will get to it in the next. Okay, yeah, when the next round is fine. Yeah.
Thank you, Jana, for this overview of the various initiatives. Dennis, we've burdened you this morning with our own Western Balkans discussion, and we wanted to bring a new person to the table. You run the expert group in Moldova, you work for the Lithuanian Center, and you've also done research on what can Moldova and Ukraine and the new candidates learn from the Western Balkans. We also know that today the Commission was about to report on the level of completion of the benchmarks that were set for Ukraine and Moldova. So we would appreciate a reflection on the first panel. How does a Moldovan view the first discussion that we had on the first panel, and how is the mood and the expectations in Moldova, Ukraine, or in the eastern part of this trio as to what is happening in the Western Balkans, and how can we potentially link these two discussions together? I might give you an extra minute because I asked too many questions.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be in Skopje. It's my first time here, and I have enjoyed the first session. I think that I have met some of the speakers previously, and it was interesting to really reflect together with them upon what has been done until now and what we can do in the future. I have to say that as I am the first time in Skopje, and I will also probably mention a general feeling that we can notice in Eastern Partnership region, and especially in the associated trio about Western Balkans, is that this region is rather perceived as terra incognita, And I think that this is a very important aspect to the conversation, because until now, the Moldovan or Ukrainian or Georgian perspective about the EU was very limited. We knew about the existence of 6 Western Partnership, Western Balkan countries, but the focus was on Eastern Partnership region, and the EU and its neighborhood policy with this element of Eastern Partnership region with 6 former Soviet republics was the focus. So the focus was not together or in line with those who were with clear perspective about the EU integration and with clear roadmap. So they have been candidate state, or they have been very close to open the accession negotiations. So therefore, right now, with the war in Ukraine, with the Russian aggression war against Ukraine, and the consequences that Moldova is facing to a large extent, as well as Georgia, which according to the government in Tbilisi is facing risks of upsetting Russia if they start to speak in a harsh voice, with a harsh voice against Russian interest in the region. So all this makes the 3 associated countries more interested, and I think will make even more interested in the experience of Western Balkans. This is, of course, something that we have to develop through conversation, through dialogue, through socialization, and many other issues to create platforms for bilateral communication between the 2 regions, which are so diverse, which are so different from within, but also between each other, that it will require probably a lot of time and a lot of resources to really open up the debates and actually create these avenues for conversation. But the second aspect that I wanted to speak about when it comes to comparing the 2 regions is, of course, the approach towards EU perspective. I have to remind that while the Western Balkans are talking about the EU membership perspective or seeing themselves in the EU for 20 years, again, Ukraine and Moldova plus Georgia is talking about that over the last year. Before that, we had the recognition by the EU of the EU aspirations of the 3 countries. 2 of them, Georgia and Ukraine, have it in the constitution. The EU membership is one of the national priority. Moldova doesn't have it. I think that we are close to probably adopt such a decision in the nearest future, because the political situation is of such nature that there is predisposition to have as much as possible European integration as well as Euro-Atlantic cooperation. So this EU perspective is also something that is probably closing the gaps between the 2 regions. And I think that very soon we are going to talk about not just a convention for Western Balkan countries, but also actually a convention for Western Balkan countries and associated trio, a common platform where we'll have a lot of competition, where we'll have probably benchmarks that will probably also incentivize the Western Balkan countries to be more committed and to actually reignite their interest for the EU enlargement, because we speak about competition, both for the pre-accession funds that will be stiffer in the nearest future, because we have a country like Ukraine that will require not only post-war reconstruction, but in general is a big country. It has more than 40 million. And overall, the population of the Western Balkans is 2.5 smaller than that of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia taken together. So it will be a huge competition for who is performing better and who is delivering on reforms. And probably this is exactly what should be used by our partners in Western Balkans in order to exactly create this kind of new driver for more results in terms of getting closer and aligning with the EU standards. And the third aspect of this kind of comparative approach between the 2 regions is the Russian factor. And this is a very important aspect because for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, in a way, the pusher towards the EU is exactly the threat of Russian interference in the domestic affairs, the attempt to damage certain reforms through subversive actions, and so on and so forth. This is not the case for Western Balkans. Yes, the disinformation is very much discussed about Russia in the region, but we don't talk about Russia being present in the region to the extent except Serbia and the Srpska Republika, to be fair. to the extent that it can actually boycott and sabotage the EU process. Who can do that and who is doing, I think, are the political elites and the corrupt political elites in the region. So the Russian factor is going to be, again, very important. And last year, unfortunately, I think that some countries like Ukraine and Moldova especially felt certain concerns with regard to how close certain countries in the Western Balkans can be with regard to Russia. And I speak about the concerns coming from Moldovan side when we discussed about the intention of Russia to organize subversive actions in Moldova, and the suspects who were listed or who were mentioned publicly by the Moldovan officials, and it was related to sportsmen from Montenegro and football fans from Serbia. Up until now, we don't know how valid, how accurate those statements were made, which based on which evidence those statements were made. But again, this was the political perception, which was transferred to the public perception, and this is again not helping very much to actually create a positive image of Western Balkans in associated trio countries. So these are the three elements that I would probably underline for comparing the two regions. But now quickly about the solutions to make this kind of connection and to create the bridges between the regions possible. As I mentioned before, I believe in the power of socialization of the political elites as well as economic and academic elites. This is something which has been missing for a long time. And I believe that the platform that the EU should provide, not only can, but also should provide for exactly this communication between the two regions, that at some point should become just one region, bigger region of candidate states, not two different geographically speaking, but actually a bigger one, which integrates all the countries that have a clear EU perspective, should be a way to do the socialization. The second point would be probably about searching for areas of common interest. And in my view, the accession or the access to pre-accession funds is where we could look for lessons learned by the Western Balkan countries, because there are also many other things where Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia should not look at: the quality of certain reforms, the rule of law, the fight against corruption. I think that here, unfortunately, Western Balkans countries cannot really provide good lessons for the associated trio. But when it comes to how you have dealt so far with using the funds that are already provided, maybe here there are some options, good alternatives also for Moldova, Ukraine, that are already candidate states, and for Georgia, which probably will become a candidate state by the end of this year. We will see. And last but not least is obviously about the public diplomacy. In my view, and here is, this is also linked somehow to what has been discussed in the first session, and this is about the communication by the EU, but also by the voices, critical voices from within the regions, associated trio and the Western Balkans. In my view, there is a lack of understanding of how the public diplomacy should be conducted, as well as strategic communication wise, because we have different approaches and we have very politicized the conversation about the European Union. I think that the conversation should be more professionalized and less politicized. And when it comes to the prospect, because this was the last point on your menu of questions, I believe that both political and diplomatic signals that came from the EU diplomats and politicians, as well as from the regional politicians in the associated trio countries, is that these three countries, Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, are probably going to progress. They're going to obtain what they have asked for. And in case of Ukraine and Georgia, this is the opening of the accession negotiations next year. And for Georgia, this is obviously about the candidate status. Georgia is not ready. Let's put it this way, doesn't have the same performance as Ukraine and Moldova, but because we are witnessing a real risk of backsliding towards Russia, the EU is going to adopt political decisions with very geopolitical rationale behind. in order to make this region more resilient against Russian interference, I think that they should be really helped to progress on their pro-EU path. And here I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, especially for responding to the side dish on my menu of whether you expect to start of accession negotiations by the end of the year. Yelena, what do you make of this? Can you comment for us on the feasibility of many of these proposals, and how do we progress on reforming the EU accession process whilst building some momentum here if possible?
$1 million question. Thank you, Simonida. And it's actually great to be here, and I'm grateful to you for inviting me to speak at this event again. And it's not an easy task to come last in a row of kind of 6 excellent speakers, and we've also heard from the ambassador and the deputy prime minister before that. So what I'm going to say has a sort of a qualifier. It's based on the experience of a scholar who's been looking at the process of EU integration, both as someone who comes from the Western Balkans, but also as someone who has looked at it from international academia. Now, after this long footnote, we've seen and we've heard from the other speakers about how the new geopolitical situation, the war in itself, have seemingly revived the EU's enlargement agenda. So obviously, there have been steps such as the grant of candidacy to Ukraine and Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. We should not forget that, but also the European perspective to Georgia. And we've heard earlier on during the first panel from Radmila Šekerinska about how conflict has traditionally driven the dynamics of EU enlargement, and how essentially the Yugoslav wars have pushed the European Union to have a more open and flexible approach towards the Eastern European countries in the context of the 2004-7, to a certain degree, 13 enlargement. However, I would make a caveat here and say that this prospect of membership does not equal membership, and that there has to be, now once this promise, if you wish, of a European future, of a perspective in the EU has been made, there has to be an expectations management for the Eastern trio above all, but also a frustration management for the Western Balkan countries. Because the European Union is not ready to admit new members. And we've heard, apologies, I think I've just swallowed the bug. We've heard at the panel before how the different crises have essentially transformed Europe over the last 15 years. The financial crisis has been one of them, the migrants crisis. Immediately afterwards, there came COVID, etc. Now there is war. But I think, above all, we have to consider the most important crisis that has profoundly hit the European Union's institutional structures, and that's the fact that the EU has never institutionally adapted to the 2004-7, 13 enlargement wave. Now, what has been the experience of the EU with the entry of all of these countries? It has been the decline of democracy in most of the new European Union member states. Now, this is something that I think has deep effect and will be resonating in the context of enlargement in the future. A further element, which may sound as a technicality, but it is very much important, and we've seen it perhaps most obviously in the context of this country, is that more members means more veto points. And this will reflect upon the enlargement process, not only in the context of the Western Balkans, but I guess that there will be things to expect also in the context of Ukraine, Moldova, potentially also Georgia. There's the need for expectation and frustration management also because of the issues that these countries who are candidate states are facing at the moment. Most of them are divided societies. Many of them are societies whose borders are questioned or contested. None of these countries are the democratic institutions stable, or none of them is also a pioneer in the context of the rule of law. And also, as we've heard, there is a context in which external actors such as Russia, China, but also the Gulf states have actually enough leverage to exploit some of the vulnerabilities of these states and contribute to their, in a way, democratic deconsolidation. Now, let's consider the different options that are on the plate nowadays in the context of the future of enlargement. And I hope that I haven't presented an image that's too gloomy. There are things to look forward to. Against this broad context in which this prospect for EU integration of all of these countries is happening. There have been, especially at the onset of Russian invasion to Ukraine, calls for fast admission of Ukraine and possibly Moldova to the European Union. Now, that's something that we all know is not going to happen. And it would also need technically a treaty revision or an absolute consensus within the Union for a new swift enlargement, if you wish, which is highly unlikely in the context of how the EU actually functions. And B, I do not think it would be healthy for either the Western Balkans or any of the Eastern Partnership countries to immediately access the European Union, and especially in countries where you have leaders who have authoritarian tendencies, because they would then cash in on the fast accession, thus cementing their authoritarian rule. So that's not an option if you wish. The second thing that's being considered is this accession step by step. I prefer to refer to it stepwise or gradual accession, if you wish, rather than staged. And I know that Srdjan might object, but I think that it actually says more. And I think that this idea of having different elements of the process being unlocked as the country progresses through stages is something that's seriously considered in many circles and in Brussels as an interim solution, because it's better than what we have now. However, I think that there are a couple of caveats that come with that option as well. One of the important ones, again, the kinds of veto points that solution creates might actually prolong the actual accession process of these countries to the European Union. So I think that when considering the step-by-step accession, perhaps considering different elements that might prove as hurdles on the way to the EU is also important. The third option being considered is this accelerated accession through the phasing in to selective participation in different EU policies. And I think to a certain degree, and this is where I want to add on what Jana has said, it's something that to a certain degree is happening already. I think in the domain of participation in EU agencies, coastal guards, border agencies, etc., there's quite a lot of integration in that domain as well. The point is that we do not know to what extent this is actually happening and what would need to be done to further or to deepen this kind of an option. Now, I think that this is something that could be explored further, especially in view of its potential, and this is something that Radmila Šakerinska also mentioned before, of bringing the region, of socializing in, if you wish, progressively the region to the EU. And this would not be necessarily an alternative to EU accession, but perhaps a way for these countries to learn the ways of doing things in a different way. And by learning how EU's policies are made in Brussels, or by participating in different sectoral policies, if you wish, the Western Balkan states would adopt these ways of doing things. So I think that bottom line, this is something that might have some value added. And finally, and this is something that that I think is an important thing to consider, are the dissonant voices, if you wish, within the European Union. And I think that this is something to consider also in the context of the upcoming EP elections, and especially think that the center and center-right parties are advocating. And this is this Europe of different constellations. And this is where the Macron proposal and the initiative of the European political community comes into play. So that there would be these different circles to which different countries would become. Now, it's nothing new. In a way, some sort of differentiated cooperation along or across the European continent has always existed in different domains. But I think what's important to have in mind, and this is where I go back to the speech of Deputy Prime Minister Maricic, is that none of these alternative or complementary proposals is in a way ideal. And in itself, none of them is sufficient for pushing these countries closer to the EU or invigorating or making enlargement happen eventually. However, they shouldn't be considered as a sole substitute for enlargement, but rather in a political moment when enlargement itself is a difficult option, or an option for which there's no clear timeline and there are no clear mechanisms that would work. There are mechanisms, but we've seen over the last 20 years that they have their limitations. These options can, at least in parts, be considered to complement and progressively prepare the candidates to reach the level of standards of economic development that's comparable to what is there in the EU as the EU average, I would say. So I will leave it at this, and we can continue in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena. I'll open immediately for questions. I have several, but I would like to give the floor to the audience. Malinka, right? And in the front row. Yes, we'll collect 3 and then, or more if there are.
Okay. I must say that with the discussion, to me is a bit déjà vu. Because I remember gradual integration in the on paper, it's losing all time. Yeah, just a moment. So basically, the topics were there, but the hopes were much higher. So 20 years after, and with a new impetus for enlargement, very reluctantly driven by the Russian aggression on Ukraine, my question is, what do you foresee for the next 10 or 20 years? These discussions were lively in the 90s. Back now, nobody is talking about it. We are like self-censored. What is, now to explain a bit more, the discussion is open. We saw, at least at the Bratislava Summit, divergent opinions. We had the German and the French position reforms and then enlargement. And then we had the Austrian position, Western Balkans can go in without reforms. We have probably a working group, again, German Frank, working on proposals. And from what I heard this morning from our officials, the president of the commission has said that we as Macedonia might miss what's going on to happen next year. And what's going on to happen next year is some form of gradual integration and more money. How much money? And that is going to happen before the elections in the European Parliament. The expectations also are that Ukraine and Moldova might open the negotiations, of course, without any prospects for when ending them. So my question is for you, what do you expect? Starting of the negotiations, forming of a big negotiations group, regardless Eastern Partnership, Western Balkans, or dividing into more groups, Western Balkans, and then the Eastern Partnership, or you maybe just expect the delay of the discussion or any new commitments in the future. So these are my three options, but you might have other options for what is going to happen.
Thank you, Malenka. We have one more here.
Околу капацитетот за проширување. Една работа е јасна. Околу капацитетот за проширување јасно е дека ние треба да достигнеме некој и извршиме некои задачи, да бидеме препознаени и прифатени како веродостојни кандидати за членство. Меѓутоа, недоволно е јасно друго, а тоа е каков е капацитетот на Европската Унија. Ова што го гледаме овде пред нас е 20 години како имаме Солунска агенда, а ја би рекол 30 години, пошто Солунска декларација е од 2003 година, кога Западен Балкан е препознаен како составен дел и кој припаѓа на Европска Унија. Во регионот не постои убеденост дека со оглед на билатерални спорови, историја и сето што се случувало неодавно и што се случува денес, можеме да поминеме без вето од соседни земји членки. Прашањето е дали доколку се задржи принципот на консензус и на вето и правото на вето, дали воопшто ние и источно-европските членки можеме да бидеме вклучени во Европска Унија. При тоа не треба да се заборави дека пред 30 години се размислуваше многу порадикално. Имавме предлог за Европски устав, кој решаваше сите овие прашања сврзани со членство, проширување, безбедносни прашања, финанси. Дали она што беше концепт кој го предводеше Жискар д'Естен е заборавено во Европската Унија или има некои нови иновативни идеи на тој план? Благодарам.
Благодарам. Уште некое прашање? Повелете се.
Thank you. So I will address this to all the speakers present. We speak about the 20 years after the Thessaloniki Summit, but we also had I think you mentioned, Ms. Shekerinska's speech before, which I unfortunately missed, but I'm reminded that before the wars in Yugoslavia, there was an attempt by the European Commission and Jacques Delors and the Troika to have the access of the Balkan countries at the time, no, Western Balkans, without any splitting of Yugoslavia, but also through a political decision. So we're speaking about lessons learned, but I fear that the biggest lesson, Dennis also mentioned the Russian aggression in Ukraine as a catalyst for this accession. But from your side, you're a bit pessimistic about how that will affect the societies due to the authoritarian leaders. But at the time, we also had authoritarian leaders, and we saw how the lack of accession affected the Balkans, and we are here 30 plus years after that. So if I would kindly ask you to provide maybe some answers or pathways to what will be a way ahead as it comes forward from the screen, that we actually go past this lesson and finally learn it. Because at some point, a lesson learned is a blessing missed. So what would you say is something that we can do right now to achieve what we couldn't 30 plus years ago? Thank you very much.
I think we have enough definitely to stay until for a long time, but if there's any more questions, I'll ask at the end another round as well. We have 3 questions from the European Policy Institute, from the European Movement, and our colleague, and I will just add one for Jana potentially. You mentioned the European Commission coming up with a possible plan, and yeah, everyone I think agrees that in this cacophony and opinions, we really expected something more from the Commission. But is there, you're in Brussels often, are there discussions in the Commission as to how do we actually respond to the political impetus and to this new geopolitical momentum and so on and so forth? Because in my view, enlargement has to be driven administratively from some point. And as much as we tend to not like to put anyone on the spot, it often feels to be lacking. I mean, this goes along the lines that we feel here also, that after this stagnation of a decade, that possibly we have unlearned enlargement, both here and both in the Commission, or the capacity is very weak. I heard yesterday at a panel that I was attending, actually, if a dentist does not take a tooth in 10 years, if they don't practice what they were trained to do, then are they a dentist after 10 years? So I think the question goes for the people working here on integration, but also in the Commission. If you're not really pushing an agenda, how do we move forward? And if that's okay, I'll start with you, Jana, and then we'll go in the same order.
Yeah, sure, Simonida. So I will first start with your question. I think we all have been quite frustrated with the European Commission not taking enough initiative as was expected. And from what we heard today, from what we heard from Ursula von der Leyen in Bratislava, I believe now they are going to come up with something more concrete. And I think the game changer was last June, the European Council's conclusions, where the European Council actually tasked the European Commission with coming up with concrete ideas and concrete suggestions how to turn the methodology into practice. So, and also another thing is when we talk about timing and when enlargement could happen and what time frame are we cooperating in, I think, I would like to emphasize the elections to the European Parliament and the formation of new institutions, which will be in 1 year's time. Because if the European Commission truly wants to show that it is geopolitical as it claims to be, and that it is serious about enlargement, it also claims to be, then we ideally should see some bold, ambitious actions during their term, and not relying on, well, mostly the EU member states tasking or giving the directives or directions to the new European Commission to deal with enlargement. So now we have the momentum. We talked about it with the war in Ukraine, and how suddenly enlargement really, or integration really is back on the European Union's agenda, but the momentum won't last forever. So we really should utilize the next year to the maximum. Also, when we have Malinka questions about about what will happen, this is $1 million question, I believe. And of course, there are different possible scenarios. If I were to be optimist, then if the Western Balkan countries or general the candidates got truly serious about the reforms, if there was truly existing competition, but positive competition between the associated trio and the Western Balkans, if the European Union member states would actually be able to somehow negotiate and find some agreements on adopting qualified majority voting in a common foreign and security policy, including enlargement process, then ideally within 10 to 20 years, we would see a union of 36 members. But what I also agree with Jelena, that even in the most optimistic scenarios, we would see more differentiated integration than we are seeing now. So even if the 36 members would be full members of the European Union, they probably would absent from some areas of cooperation. They would be, like we would have these different bodies, different constellations of countries cooperating more deeply on certain issues. That also already is, these provisions are actually in the EU law. It is possible for countries which are interested in advancing their cooperation outside of the scope of all members. It is possible for them, and I think we will move in the direction. And again, if I were to be more realistic than optimistic, I'm actually not afraid, but I think for now, the gradual integration is actually the way to go. And unfortunately, yes, it's at least from my impression, that's definitely true, that it's acceptable for some EU member states only because it kind of evades the question of full membership and having these very difficult discussions on actual enlargement. So but again, like I agree with Jelena and Ms. Shekerinska, it's very, very important, even if we cooperate only in some sectors, in some areas, it's important mechanism, it's important step towards building not only the learning process, but towards building trust between the EU members and the candidate countries. It's about building the capacities of the candidates to actually deal with different EU policies, different EU funds that are available and so on. But most importantly, it's about getting to know each other better and showing that, and ideally showing that the candidate countries actually can be reliable partners and serious partners for the European Union. When we talked about whether enlargement basically can progress without the shift towards QMV, yes, this is a very difficult question, and I'm afraid it cannot, to be completely honest. But I think while the war in Ukraine and the idea or the discussions about the absorption capacity and so on actually stimulated this discussion at the European level about the EU reform and introduction of QMV in more areas. It's actually a long overdue discussion. The European Union should have this discussion already, just because if it's in its own interest, if it wants to be a credible global actor, if it wants to be able to deal with the competition in the global arena, it will have to be more actionable, and it's not at this point. And if the enlargement should serve as the catalyst for this difficult discussion, then be it. But what we are seeing now is that the situation or the constellations among the EU member states are actually becoming more and more blurred. Before we saw more clear blocks, let's say, of countries pro-enlargement and against enlargement. Now we have much more difficult situation when some countries are for enlargement, but they don't want the QMV or the internal reform in general. There are countries which actually, of course, like Germany, France, leading the initiative, pushing for QMV, pushing for internal reform in exchange for enlargement. But there are also other countries which actually say that internal reform is needed, but we don't still want QMV in common foreign and security policy. So, and then we have all these groups of friends of the Western Balkans, friends of Ukraine, friends of associated trio. And so the situation is becoming more and more complicated, and I don't think it's actually contributing necessarily towards finding consensus. So it will be a difficult discussion for the EU member states, and it will be a lot about trade-offs and finding ways how to persuade different countries with different positions to actually find some common grounds. I hope I addressed most of the questions.
Thank you, Anna. Denis.
Yeah, the questions were very provocative, I would say. I have to admit that for me it was a big surprise to again realize that after 20 years we still talk about failures in the integration of the Western Balkans into the EU. Yes, of course, there were many positive steps, and they were mentioned in the first, especially during the first panel, but we have more missteps and more missed opportunities than actually positive progresses that we can underline. And here is the interesting aspect of this question. We have had 6 countries, and we still have 17.5 million population. And during 20 years, the EU didn't really manage to bring the region to such an extent closer to the EU, so that we don't have these questions when the accession will actually happen. Do we need for that 10 years or 20 years or even more? So there is something which is wrong in the approaches of the EU. And we have to admit that, because at this point, when we have already 2 candidate states, as well as Georgia probably will receive it again for geopolitical reasons more than anything else, as well as Armenia could become another country that could have that can have very radical geopolitical changes with regard to their relationship with Russia and joining the associated trio at some point. I think that there will be a huge competition between countries from different regions with different history, with different capacities, and with a lot of needs for money, for financial resources, for institutional capacity building with the EU money. So I doubt that we will in 10 or 20 years will talk positively about the prospects of enlargement. And I want to be as sincere as possible, because the numbers are growing. We talk about about 50 million population in Eastern Partnership countries that want to join the EU, and I speak about Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, plus 6 countries in the Western Balkans, plus Turkey. And again, let's not forget that because Turkey didn't mention at all, and it's kind of like why, because it's also part of the 10 countries that have EU perspective. So now I think that we have to understand again that Ukraine and Turkey are huge countries, and they're going to consume the pre-accession funds just like that. So we will have to, again, balance very carefully the needs of small countries versus the huge needs, especially after the war will be over or during the war of the reparation for Ukraine. The second point is about the securitization of the enlargement process. I think that Eastern Partnership countries, especially with the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, is putting a lot of security thoughts and a lot of geopolitics in the enlargement process. This is not something which is negative, but this is something which is shifting the attention from rule of law and from other reforms that are important, as well as for the functioning of the states, and of course, the meritocracy-based approach of the EU that has been so much praised and is still an important principle that the EU is trying to uphold. And third element that I wanted to underline is about the staged versus gradual or other types of approaches that we are using when we want to speak about the enlargement. In my view, we should really focus on quality and speed. Quality is really very important, because otherwise we will deal with social and political fatigue. And our colleagues in the first panel have wonderfully described what is happening and what could happen in the future. We have to keep this in mind. And the second element of this kind of nexus, quality versus is the speed. And in this regard, I think that we have to acknowledge that when we want to make things happening faster, we don't take into account the sustainability. And the sustainability is unfortunately something which is related to institutions, and they are not capable to cope or to catch up with the political commitments or political, let's say, appetite, as well as the populations, because I think that until we are getting grayer, or we are aging, we are going to be fewer, and it's about the brain drain. And I think that what will be the challenge for the countries is that we will not have human resources to actually really not just join the EU, but in general function as states, because again, without the population and the GDP, which was again mentioned in the first panel, I don't think that we should really speak loud about the perspectives of becoming the EU member state, where the capacity to act and to be as a robust economy is very important in order to, in general, exist as a sovereign state. And the last point that I wanted to raise is about sticks and carrots. I think that the first panel was really very much about carrots. Like, let's give them more money, let's look for more opportunities. Why not to also look at what we have in the toolbox of sticks? Because unfortunately, I believe that the accession conditionality doesn't work. And probably we have to add other types of conditionality that will help us to sometimes be harsher, cut the funds, and actually put the political elites and governments in the Western Balkans countries, but as well in associated to work and to deliver reforms, not wait for more funds.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for your excellent questions. And Malinka, I completely agree with you. The discussions that we see here are pretty much the discussions that have been around since the early 1990s. Also, the famous proposal for the European political community, or whatever it was called at the time, the various forms of differentiated integration, they didn't fly off as much as they're flying off now, or at least rhetorically. What will happen in practice is something to be seen. And this is where we gets to your question as to what to expect, what do we foresee in the next 10 to 15 years. And I think it's very difficult to think that much forward right now. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the last three and a half years have dramatically changed as to what's happening in the world and how especially institutions in the EU are responding to different external challenges. So I think that whatever is going to happen with the dynamics of enlargement or the future of the Western Balkans will not depend only on the relationship between the EU and Western Balkans itself. It will depend on what happens in Ukraine, how Russia will then behave in accordance to what's happening in Ukraine, whether they go bonkers or whether they lose the war in some reasonable period of time. And I think that those are the factors that will substantively impact on the enlargement agenda and how it unfolds. We also have to have in mind the more recent AI developments, which I think will fly off in the next 10 to 15 years, and how those might essentially impact on how the European Union sees itself and its role in international relations and how it relates to the different neighbors. And this is where I actually found your speech, Dennis, quite inspiring, because I've seen that there's an incredible difference in perspective between how the Western Balkan states see the enlargement process after 20 years and how the Eastern Trio, if you wish, or quartet or quintet or whatever it ends up being, see it. And how they see the Western Balkans performing over the last 20 years. And I think that this is important. And today, it's kind of for the first time from you on this panel, I've heard the word competition, which is something that's been quite iterated quite a lot in the EU circles for the last, I would say, a year and a half. So I think that those are the factors that will determine how things are going to progress. I do not want to paint kind of a really gloomy world, nor do I want to give everyone unicorns and flying butterflies as a future. But I think that it is uncertain and that there are a lot of challenges that will be on the way, both for the Western Balkans in terms of realizing these countries' full capacities and potential, but also in terms of relating what the Western Balkans have been through and how they are responding to those challenges to how the Eastern Trio is going to take off in the process. Now, just briefly, two things, and then I'll wrap up. On the question on the capacity of the EU, and I think that there Jana has mentioned the opening up of the discussions on the future of the European Union itself and how these have been informed about these debates on the EU's capacity. Now, one thing we have to understand is the EU is not a state. So the EU is a sui generis, if you wish. It's a creature of law. And a lot of the ways in which the EU functions, the question of veto versus QMV, especially for enlargement matters, will play into how the debates on the European future of the Western Balkans will play out. Now, speaking of treaty reform, which would be needed for the QMV versus veto in enlargement, it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that will probably be a part of a broader conversation on the future of Europe, despite the existing proposals, et cetera, but it will take a long time, and it might actually take longer than whatever the 10, 15 years that that Malinka has asked about. And finally, just for the last question, what can we do better than that? I don't think that the political and social moments of 30 years ago or even 20 years ago are comparable to what we have now. But what I think is important for all of the countries in the region is to find a way to keep their houses tidy while creating really good relationships with their neighbors, because I think that that's where the future is, building on the regional networks and then eventually gradually through one way model or another, getting closer to the EU and the European future for the region. So I hope not to be at the 40 years after the Thessaloniki Summit conference in 20, but let's hope for something merrier. And I'll leave it on the optimistic note.
Thank you, Jelena. Are there any pressing questions or comments in the audience? Because we can leave it at the optimistic note. Yeah, I probably should not say a word. I would like to thank my panelists, Jana, Denis, and Jelena, and also the first panel, and to you for sticking with us. Actually, this is 4 minutes later than we had originally planned, so it's not that bad as the beginning. So let's hope that that will be the motto of the next conference, actually, that we end up better than the way that we started. Thank you. I wish you a good afternoon, and I hope to see you on the next event of EPI. Thank you.